He could buy the entire airport. Every gate, every terminal, every overpriced coffee shop tucked between the duty-free perfume counters and the shoe shine stands. Declan Whitmore had the kind of money that made ordinary problems disappear with a single phone call. But standing at Gate 47 of Chicago O'Hare International Airport on a gray Tuesday afternoon in November, with his 6-year-old daughter's hand wrapped around two of his fingers and their flight already boarding, he saw something that stopped him completely. Something no amount of money in the world could have manufactured, purchased, or arranged. A woman kneeling on the cold floor beside a stranger, refusing to leave. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end, and let's begin. The announcement had already come twice. Final boarding call for United Flight 182 to Seattle. All remaining passengers should proceed immediately to Gate 47. Declan heard it the second time and pulled his rolling carry-on a little faster, his daughter Maisie jogging to keep up beside him, her small backpack bouncing with every step, the stuffed rabbit she'd named Professor sticking out from the half-open zipper. Daddy, you're going too fast again. I know, Bug. Almost there. You always say almost there and then it's still far. He glanced down at her. She had her mother's eyes, wide, dark, and entirely too perceptive for a first grader. Fair point, he said, and slowed down maybe 15%. They'd been in Chicago for 4 days. A series of meetings with a logistics company he was in the process of acquiring, 2 dinners with board members who talked too much and said too little, and 1 afternoon at the Field Museum that Maisie had declared the best day of my whole life because she got to stand next to a dinosaur skeleton that was taller than their house. He'd taken a picture of her standing underneath it with her arms stretched wide, her head tilted all the way back, mouth open. It was already his phone wallpaper. The terminal at O'Hare was loud in the specific way that large airports are always loud. Not one overwhelming noise, but 100 smaller ones stacked on top of each other. Rolling suitcases. Gate announcements in 3 languages, a child crying somewhere near the Starbucks. 2 businessmen arguing in low, clipped voices about a spreadsheet. The particular hiss of the moving walkway and the recorded voice telling everyone to please hold the handrail. Declan moved through it the way he moved through most things, efficiently, without wasting attention on anything that didn't require it. He'd learned that early. When you ran 3 companies and raised a child alone and slept maybe 5 hours a night if you were lucky, you got very good at filtering. You learned what deserved your focus and what didn't, which is why he almost missed her entirely. They were passing the seating area between gates 44 and 45, one of those wide, carpeted stretches with rows of gray chairs bolted together, a charging station in the middle, and a large window overlooking the tarmac. When he saw the crowd part slightly and registered something wrong with the geometry of the scene. Most of the people in that section were standing up, which was already unusual. A few were backing away. 2 were holding their phones up. Recording. They were recording. He slowed without quite deciding to. Maisie tugged his hand. Daddy? 1 second. He could see it now. An elderly man on the floor. He'd collapsed somewhere between the chairs and the window. Maybe been walking, maybe stood up too fast, and was lying on his back with one arm outstretched and his gray suit jacket twisted sideways beneath him. His face was pale in a way that went beyond ordinary. His lips had a faint blue tint at the edges. And kneeling beside him, pressing 2 fingers to the side of his neck with her other hand flat on his chest, was a woman who looked like she'd been in the middle of running somewhere herself when she stopped. She had a canvas duffel bag on the floor beside her, half unzipped and tipped over where she'd dropped it in a hurry. Her coat, dark green, slightly too big for her, the kind you bought at a discount store because it was warm and not because it was anything else, was pushed back off one shoulder. Her hair was pulled into a ponytail that had started coming loose sometime in the last few hours. She was 30, maybe, give or take a year. She was not a medical professional. He could tell that immediately. No badge, no uniform, no practiced clinical stillness. Her hands were shaking slightly. Her jaw was tight, but she was not leaving. "Sir?" she said, leaning closer to the man. "Sir, can you hear me?" She looked up at the crowd, and there was something in her expression that wasn't panic exactly, more like controlled desperation, The look of someone who had decided to handle a situation they weren't equipped for because the alternative was doing nothing. Has anyone called 911? Somebody needs to call. Does this airport have a medical team? Someone go find someone in a uniform, please. 3 people looked at their phones. One woman turned and walked away at a fast clip in the direction of the gate. Nobody moved toward them. I already called, a man in a business suit said from about 8 feet back, not stepping any closer. Okay, good. Thank you. She turned back to the elderly man. Sir, my name is Lena. I'm right here. You're not alone, okay? Help is coming. She pressed 2 fingers back to his neck. Her eyes closed for 2 seconds while she focused on the pulse. Then they opened again, and she repositioned slightly, keeping one hand on his sternum. Stay with me. I need you to stay with me. Maisie had gone very quiet beside Declan. She was watching with the serious, unblinking attention the children sometimes give to things adults would rather look away from. Is that man sick? She whispered. Yeah, Declan said quietly. He is. Is that lady a doctor? He watched Lena pull the man's jacket lapel aside to loosen the collar of his shirt, speaking to him in a low, steady voice the entire time, never stopping, never looking away from him even while her duffel bag sat tipped over on the floor, and her own gate, wherever it was, sat somewhere in this building without her standing at it. No, he said. I don't think she is. Then why is she the only one helping? He didn't answer that. He didn't have a good one. The airport medical team arrived 4.5 minutes later. 2 EMTs with a wheeled kit, followed by a third pushing a stretcher. They moved through the crowd, which finally parted with some purpose, and reached the man on the floor. The lead EMT crouched down, asked a quick series of questions, and Lena answered all of them. Heart rate, approximate time he'd been unconscious, whether he'd said anything before he went down, whether anyone nearby had seen what preceded the collapse. He was standing at the window, she said. I saw him sort of grab the back of a chair. I thought he was just tired. Then he just went down. His pulse is weak, but it's there. It's been steady for the last 3 minutes. The EMT nodded, not unkindly, but with the focused efficiency of someone who needed her out of the way now. Okay, we've got it from here. Thank you. Lena stood up. Her knees were probably stiff from the floor. She'd been kneeling on hard carpet over concrete for several minutes at least. She picked up her duffel bag, zipped it halfway, and stepped back to give them room. She was breathing a little harder than normal. Her hand, the one that had been on the man's chest, pressed briefly against her own sternum, like she was steadying something internal. And then she looked up at the departures board. Declan watched her face change. It didn't collapse or crumble. She wasn't that kind of person. He'd already gathered that much. But something went out of it. Some brightness or tension or forward momentum just drained away. She stood very still for a moment, reading the board, and then she closed her eyes and tilted her head back slightly and exhaled through her nose. He followed her gaze to the board. Gate 42, flight to Portland. Departed. He checked his watch. The flight had left 7 minutes ago. A gate agent was already walking past, clipboard in hand, pulling the boarding pass scanner on a cart behind her. Done. Closed. Gone. Lena lowered her head. She reached up with one hand and tucked a strand of loose hair back behind her ear. Then she hoisted her bag onto her shoulder, looked once more at the EMTs working on the elderly man. Confirmed he was in good hands, that much was clear from the way she exhaled, and walked to the nearest row of seats and sat down. Not dramatically. Not with visible grief. She just sat down and put her bag on the floor and looked at her hands in her lap. Declan stood there another 10 seconds. Daddy. Maisie tugged his hand again. Our flight. Yeah. He turned. Yeah. Okay. They made the flight. They were the last 2 passengers to board, and the gate agent gave him a look that he ignored, and they found their seats in the 3rd row. He always booked the front of the plane, mostly so Maisie had somewhere to put Professor without worrying about the overhead bin. And he buckled her in and then sat down himself and pulled out his phone. He stared at it for a moment without doing anything. Professor wants the window seat, Maisie announced. Professor is a stuffed rabbit. He still has feelings. Declan switched seats with Professor. He ended up in the middle. His 6'1" frame and the middle seat of a plane were not a natural pairing, but Maisie smiled at him from the window side, pressed her nose against the glass, and he decided it was fine. He looked at his phone again. He had 14 unread messages from his assistant, 3 emails from the acquisition team, and 1 text from his mother that said, "Did Maisie eat actual vegetables in Chicago or just mac and cheese again? Be honest." He ignored all of them for now and opened the airport's public Wi-Fi. Then he thought about the woman on the floor and what it had cost her to still be sitting in that terminal. He thought about her face when she looked at the departures board. He thought about Maisie asking why she was the only one helping. He didn't ask his assistant to look into it right away. He thought about it for most of the flight, through the drink service that Maisie took extremely seriously, ordering apple juice and then requesting exactly 2 pretzels, and then changing her mind to 3. And through the patch of mild turbulence that made the woman across the aisle grip her armrest, and that Maisie slept through entirely, tipped sideways against him with Professor wedged under her chin. He looked out the window at the dark above the clouds and thought about what it meant to miss your flight because you wouldn't leave a stranger on the floor. He thought about what that said about a person. He thought about what it cost to have that kind of character, not abstractly, not philosophically, but actually, in real dollars, in missed opportunities. In a year of working multiple jobs for a single plane ticket to a single interview that represented a single chance to climb out of a hole. He didn't know any of that yet, not the specifics. But he knew the flight had already left when she stood up, which meant she'd known it might leave when she knelt down. She'd made the calculation and knelt anyway. His assistant's name was Patrick Calloway, 34, scrupulously competent, allergic to both inefficiency and garlic, which were his 2 most notable characteristics. And Declan called him from the car on the way home from SeaTac, keeping his voice low while Maisie dozed against the window in her car seat. "I need you to find someone for me," he said. "Client?" Patrick said, the sound of a keyboard already clicking in the background. "No, a woman who was at O'Hare today. She missed a flight out of Gate 42, Portland bound, departed around 4:15. She had a green coat, canvas duffel bag. Name might be Lena something. She told it to a man on the floor when she was helping him. I need a full name if you can get it." A pause. "How do I find her from that?" "Try the booking records for that flight first. Women traveling alone, Portland connection, that departure time. Cross-reference with anything that shows a late cancellation or no-show. It's a long shot, but try it. This is a lot of moving pieces for a woman in a green coat. Patrick, I'm already doing it. Don't make it weird. I just need to know who she is." "Of course," Patrick said, in the voice of a man who was storing this information for future use and would absolutely make it at least slightly weird. "I'll call you in the morning." He didn't call in the morning. He called at 11:47 that night, which was unusual enough that Declan picked up immediately. "Lena Hayes," Patrick said, 30 years old, from Millhaven, Oregon, population about 8,000, kind of a nothing town about 60 miles east of Portland. She worked 3 jobs. Part-time caregiver at an assisted living facility, grocery store night shifts on weekends, and something called home companion services, which is essentially being paid to sit with elderly people who don't have family nearby. Declan sat down on the edge of his bed. "Okay?" "She's been saving for almost a year, best I can piece together from some public records and some, let's say, creatively accessed background data. The flight cost her $800, which is what she had. No credit cards. 1 bank account that currently has $43 in it." The number landed somewhere in Declan's chest and settled there, heavy and specific. $43. "The interview," he said. "What was it for?" "Director of Community Outreach for a nonprofit called the Hartwell Foundation, based in Portland. They run programs for elderly care, housing support, that kind of thing. It was scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. They interviewed candidates from across 3 states to get to the final round. She was one of 6 people asked to come in person." "Was one of 6? "The interview was in person only. They don't do remote or phone substitutions for the final round. I called the foundation's main line, posing as a journalist doing a piece on nonprofit hiring practices, and the woman I spoke to was very forthcoming about their policies when I complimented her on their website." Despite everything, Declan almost smiled. "Good work." "She's also been trying to call them," Patrick continued. The foundation. She called twice after the flight departed. I can't access her actual phone records, but I can see 2 calls to the Hartwell Foundation's main number placed from a Chicago area payphone between 4:45 and 5:10 this evening. He thought about that. A payphone. She'd used a payphone. She probably doesn't have a data plan, he said, mostly to himself. Or she burned through it. Either way. He stood up and walked to the window. His house was in a quiet neighborhood north of downtown Seattle, one of those places that was technically a suburb but felt like a different planet from the city's edges. The street outside was empty. A streetlight cast a circle of orange on wet pavement. It had rained while he was in the air. Where is she now? Still in Chicago, most likely. She doesn't have another ticket. The next available flight to Portland on the same booking would have required her to pay a change fee she can't cover, and there's no indication she's rebooking. My best guess is she's going to take a bus. There's a Greyhound that connects to Portland in about 21 hours from downtown Chicago. 21 hours. On a bus. After everything. Find me her contact information, Declan said. Whatever you can. Already have a cell number. It's prepaid, no guarantee it's active. Try it anyway. And Patrick, before you do anything else, I need you to pull everything you can find about the Hartwell Foundation. Who runs it? Who makes hiring decisions? Who they answer to? Why? He looked at the orange circle of light on the wet street below. Because I want to understand what she was walking toward, he said, before I figure out how to make sure she still gets there. Patrick was quiet for a moment. Then, you're going to fix this for a woman you saw for about 90 seconds in an airport. Maybe. That's either very generous or mildly unhinged, possibly both. Good night, Patrick. I'll have the foundation information by 7 a.m. He hung up and stood at the window another few minutes. The street stayed empty. The rain had reduced itself to a fine mist that caught the streetlight and made the pavement look like it had been lacquered. He thought about Maisie, asleep down the hall with Professor tucked under her arm. He thought about what she'd asked at the airport. Why is she the only one helping? And the fact that he hadn't answered because the honest answer was uncomfortable and he didn't know how to make it less so for a 6-year-old. The honest answer was that most people calculated the cost before they decided to help. They looked at the situation and they ran the math. Time lost, discomfort, risk, inconvenience. And if the numbers didn't work out in favor of stopping, they kept walking. It wasn't malice. It was just how most people were wired. Self-preservation was the default setting. Compassion was the override, and overrides required effort. But Lena Hayes, who had $43 in her bank account and had saved for nearly a year to buy one plane ticket to one interview that could change the entire trajectory of her life, she had seen a stranger go down on a cold airport floor and had knelt beside him without running the numbers at all. Or maybe she had run them, and they'd just come out different from everyone else's. He went to check on Maisie before going to bed. She was deeply asleep, one arm flung up over her head, her mouth slightly open. Professor had been repositioned at some point since he'd tucked her in. Now the rabbit was standing upright against the pillow, apparently on guard duty. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He thought about raising her in a world where the people around her were more like Lena Hayes than like the crowd that stood and filmed with their phones. He thought about what it meant to build that world deliberately, or at least to try. He thought about what it said about his own priorities, that he'd spent 4 days in Chicago closing a deal on a logistics company, and in 4 minutes at an airport he'd found something that felt more important than any of it. He turned off the hallway light and went to bed. He did not sleep particularly well. At 7:12 the next morning, Patrick called with the Hartwell Foundation information. And at 7:13, Declan recognized the name of the foundation's primary financial backer, a man he'd known for 11 years, a man who'd once told him over a very expensive bourbon that the only thing worth more than money was knowing what to do with it. Victor Ashford. He put his coffee down. Victor Ashford had founded Meridian Air in 1974, built it into one of the 10 largest commercial airlines in the country by 1991, and retired in 2003 at the age of 72 with the kind of legacy that got buildings named after it. He'd spent the 2 decades since moving his considerable resources into philanthropy, healthcare, education, elder care, housing initiatives for working families. The Hartwell Foundation was one of his more recent projects, launched 4 years ago, and it was, per Patrick's notes, genuinely well-run and well-funded and doing actual meaningful work. Victor was also 82 years old, in reasonably good health according to his most recent public appearance at a gala in Portland 6 months ago, and had been, according to his published travel schedule, in Chicago yesterday for a speaking engagement at a business leadership conference at the Marriott near O'Hare. Near O'Hare. Declan sat very still for approximately 8 seconds. Then he picked his phone up and called Victor Ashford's personal line, which he had because Victor had given it to him in 2013 and told him to use it if anything was ever genuinely important and not to waste it on things that weren't. The phone rang 4 times. Then a voice, rougher than he remembered it, said, "Whitmore, it's not even 8 o'clock." "Victor," Declan said, "I need to ask you something. Yesterday afternoon, were you at O'Hare?" A pause, then, very carefully, "Yes." "Gate 44 and 45 area, around 4 o'clock. Another pause. Longer this time. When Victor spoke again, something in his voice had shifted, quieter, more considered. "You were there," he said. "It wasn't a question. I was passing through. I saw the EMTs arrive. I didn't know it was you. I had a bad episode. My blood pressure dropped. It's been a problem this year. The doctors keep adjusting my medications, and the adjustments haven't been going well." He paused. "I'm all right. I was in the hospital until this morning. Observation. Nothing that requires you to look alarmed on my behalf. I'm glad you're all right. They tell me a young woman stayed with me." His voice changed again, something entering it that Declan didn't have a precise word for. Weight, maybe. The specific weight of being the stranger on the floor rather than the person walking past. Before the medical team arrived, apparently she'd been there for some time and she refused to leave even when the crowd thinned out. I was unconscious for most of it, so I can only go by what the EMTs told me. "Her name is Lena Hayes," Declan said. "She's 30 years old. She missed her flight to be there." Silence. "She was on her way to a job interview," he continued. "Final round. She'd been working 3 jobs for almost a year to afford the plane ticket. She called the foundation twice from a payphone after the flight left." He paused. "Victor, the foundation is yours. The Hartwell Foundation. She was interviewing for a position you fund." The silence stretched out long enough that Declan checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "What position?" Victor said finally. His voice was very quiet. "Director of Community Outreach." Another long pause. "She stayed with me," Victor said. Not to Declan, exactly. More to himself. Or to the fact itself, which seemed to need a moment of acknowledgement. While everyone else walked away. Yes. And she didn't know who I was. No, she didn't know who either of us were. She just stayed. The rain had started again outside Declan's window. Not hard, just that Pacific Northwest persistence, the light, steady drizzle that residents stopped noticing after about 2 weeks of living there. "What do you want me to do, Whitmore?" Victor said. "I want to know if you're willing to make a call," Declan said. "Not to give her the job. She has to earn that. And I genuinely believe she can, based on nothing except what I saw for 90 seconds in an airport, but I believe it. I just want to make sure the door isn't already closed before she has a chance to walk through it. And you want to be involved. I want her to have the opportunity she earned, not as charity, not as a reward for being in the right place at the right time, as a genuine, fair shot at something she'd already done the work to deserve." Victor was quiet again. Then, slowly, "You know I interview every candidate personally for leadership positions in the foundation. I know. I'm going to need a day or 2 before I'm back on my feet properly. That's fine. And I want to meet her before any decisions are made. Not as the man she saved. She doesn't need to know that part yet. Just as a member of the foundation's board." "Understood. How are you going to reach her?" "Patrick has a number." "Patrick." He could hear the faint, dry amusement in Victor's voice. "Your shadow. He prefers essential resource. I'm sure he does. Call her. Make sure she hasn't already booked the Greyhound home and given up." "What do I say?" "Tell her the foundation wants to reschedule," Victor said simply. "That's true. Tell her the interview board is aware of what happened and grateful for the delay. and that her candidacy remains active. That's also true. And Declan, his voice shifted again, back to that quieter register. Don't tell her about me. Not yet. I want to see who she is when she doesn't know she's already been seen. Declan looked out at the rain. She might say no, he said. She might have already decided it's not worth it. Then she says no, and we respect that, Victor said. But I don't think she will. People who stay on floors for strangers don't usually quit. He hung up. Declan held his phone in both hands and looked at it for a moment. Then he texted Patrick. Call the number. Tell her the foundation wants to reschedule. Use the foundation's name, not mine. And be normal about it. Don't be charming. Don't be strange. Just be a person calling to say the door is still open. Patrick replied 40 seconds later. Defining be normal feels like an enormous ask, but I'll try. Then, 30 seconds after that, also, don't be charming is going to require genuine effort, and I want that noted. Declan set his phone down and went to make breakfast. Maisie appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7:45 in her pajamas, Professor dangling from one hand, hair doing something complicated on the left side. What are you making? Eggs. Can Professor have some? Professor is a stuffed rabbit. He still gets hungry. He put a small plate on the counter next to the bigger plate. Maisie climbed up onto the bar stool, satisfied, and propped Professor against the fruit bowl. Daddy, she said, while he stirred the eggs. Yeah. That lady at the airport. Is she okay? He looked over at her. Her expression was the serious one, the one that meant she'd been thinking about something and had decided it was worth asking about. I'm working on it, he said. She considered this. Does working on it mean she's going to be okay? He thought about Lena Hayes sitting alone in a terminal with $43 in her account and a payphone call that probably went to voicemail and a Greyhound schedule she'd been looking up on her phone. He thought about the way she'd pressed her hand to the man's chest and said, "Stay with me," like it was a promise she was making for both of them. I hope so, he said. Maisie nodded, apparently satisfied with the honesty of that. She picked up her fork. Professor says she's going to be fine, she announced. Declan looked at the stuffed rabbit propped against the fruit bowl, its plastic button eyes blank and its expression, if it could be said to have one, mildly optimistic. Yeah, he said quietly. I think he might be right. The eggs burned slightly on one side because he wasn't paying attention. Maisie ate them anyway and didn't complain, which was either a sign of her good character or her considerable hunger, and he suspected it was both. Patrick called at 8:47 that morning. Lena was still at O'Hare. She hadn't left yet, which surprised even Patrick, who had assumed she'd be long gone by the time he reached her. On a bus, at a train station, or simply unreachable through whatever thin thread of prepaid data connected her to the rest of the world. But she picked up on the second ring, and her voice when she answered was flat in the specific way that voices get when a person has been sitting alone with a bad situation long enough to move past the initial shock of it and arrive somewhere quieter and more difficult. Hello? Is this Lena Hayes? A pause. Who's calling? My name is Patrick Calloway. I'm calling on behalf of the Hartwell Foundation. I'm reaching out because we understand there was a situation yesterday that prevented you from attending your scheduled interview, and we wanted to get in touch directly. Another pause, longer this time. How did you get this number? It was a fair question, and Patrick had anticipated it. Ms. Hayes, the foundation takes its candidates seriously. When you didn't arrive yesterday morning and didn't answer follow-up calls to your home number, we made some inquiries. We understand you were at O'Hare when your flight departed. He kept his voice level, professional, not warm exactly, but not cold either. Just a person doing a reasonable job in a reasonable way, which was harder than it sounded. The foundation would like to offer you a rescheduled interview at your earliest convenience. The silence that followed was long enough that Patrick checked the signal on his end. Then Lena said quietly, I already missed it. The interview date, yes, but your candidacy is still active. The board is aware of the circumstances and they've asked me to reach out personally. The interview was yesterday. There were 5 other candidates. There were 6, yourself included. The interviews are ongoing. The position hasn't been filled. Another pause. He could hear something in the background. A gate announcement. The distant shuffle of airport foot traffic. She was still there, still sitting in that terminal. Why would you reschedule for me? She said. That's not. I've never heard of a foundation doing that for one candidate. I can't speak to the foundation's internal deliberations, Patrick said, which was both technically true and deliberately uninformative. What I can tell you is that the interview coordinator has asked me to extend this offer directly. If you'd like to decline, that's entirely your choice, and we'll respect it. But if you're still interested in the position, we'd like to find a time that works. He heard her breathe. When? She said finally. That's flexible. The board member conducting final interviews has some availability later this week, Thursday or Friday, if either of those work. In Portland? In Seattle, actually. The foundation's administrative offices are here. We would, of course, cover your travel. Seattle, she repeated. Yes. She was quiet again. He could almost track what was happening on her end. The mental arithmetic, the calculation of whether this was real or some elaborate misunderstanding, the particular wariness of someone who had learned through experience that things that seemed too good were usually neither. Can you send me something in writing? She said. An email. With the foundation's contact information and someone I can call to verify. Absolutely, Patrick said, and meant it. I'll send it to the email address on your application within the hour. Okay, she said. Then, thank you for calling. Of course, Ms. Hayes. He ended the call and immediately texted Declan. She said yes, cautiously. Wants written confirmation before she commits, which is smart, and I respect it. Sending the foundation's formal correspondence now. Also, she's been sitting in that airport since yesterday afternoon. Declan read the text in the hallway outside Maisie's room, where he just finished convincing her that Professor did not, in fact, need his own seatbelt for the car ride to school, because Professor would be staying home on the bed. He typed back, make sure she has a hotel for tonight, something decent, not a motel off the highway, and book her on the first available flight to Seattle for Thursday morning, business class. Patrick's response came in under 10 seconds. She's going to know something is off if we put her in business class. Declan typed, then book economy and upgrade her at the gate. Figure it out. You know, sometimes I think you're a genius and sometimes I think you've lost your mind entirely, Patrick wrote back. This might be both, Declan replied, and put his phone in his pocket. Lena sat in the airport for another 40 minutes after the call ended, turning it over in her mind the way you turn a rock over and look at the underside, expecting something unpleasant. She was not naive. She'd grown up in a town where things that looked like opportunities usually had a catch attached to them somewhere, and the catch was usually embarrassment or debt or both. She'd learned early to read fine print and ask questions and not get ahead of herself. But she'd looked up the Hartwell Foundation when she first applied, 3 months ago. She'd spent an evening on their website reading their annual reports, looking at the programs they ran. They were real. The work was real. An elder companion network in 4 states, a caregiver training program, a housing assistance fund for senior citizens who'd outlived their savings. It was exactly the kind of work she'd been doing in miniature, on a much smaller scale, her entire working life. When she'd seen the job posting, she'd sat with it for 2 days before applying because she didn't want it too much before she knew if she had a chance. She'd had a chance. She'd gotten to the final round. And then she'd knelt down on a cold airport floor, and the chance had departed at 4:15 without her. She checked the email Patrick had sent. It was there. The Hartwell Foundation letterhead, the formal language about rescheduling, a direct contact number for the interview coordinator, a name she could verify. She called the number from the same payphone she'd used the night before. Her data was genuinely gone now, had been since sometime around midnight. And a woman named Carol answered on the 3rd ring and confirmed, professionally and without any apparent weirdness, that yes, Ms. Hayes' interview had been rescheduled and that travel arrangements were being made. Lena stood at the payphone with the receiver pressed against her ear and looked out at the terminal around her. The rolling bags and the families and the business people and the ordinary Tuesday morning chaos of a major airport, and felt something shift in her chest. Not relief exactly, more like the moment when you've been holding your breath for a long time and you finally remember that breathing is an option. Thank you, she told Carol. Of course, Carol said. We'll see you Thursday. She went to the airport hotel that afternoon. She'd been given a reservation number, and she'd triple-checked it before she dragged her duffel bag to the shuttle stop. And when she arrived at the front desk and gave her name, the clerk found the reservation immediately and handed her a key card with the practiced efficiency of someone who did this 100 times a day. Room 318, non-smoking. 4th floor, the clerk said, then corrected herself. 3rd floor. The room was clean and quiet and had a window that looked out over the runway. Lena sat on the edge of the bed and called her friend Diane back in Mill Haven. Diane, who watched her cat when she traveled. Diane, who'd driven her to the bus station 8 months ago when she started this whole process. Diane, who had 4 kids and a minivan, and the kind of practical optimism that didn't come from having an easy life, but from deciding to have it anyway. Lena, why are you calling from a hotel? I'm still in Chicago. What? Why? What happened? It's a long story. I missed the flight. How? She looked at the runway out the window. A plane was taxiing slowly away from the gate, its navigation lights blinking in the gray afternoon. Someone needed help, she said. Diane was quiet for a moment. Then, of course they did. Not accusatory, just very Diane. Are you okay? I'm okay. Actually, Diane, something kind of strange happened. Strange how? The foundation called. They want to reschedule. They're flying me to Seattle on Thursday. A long pause. Lena. I know. That doesn't happen. I know. That literally does not happen. In the history of job interviews, that does not happen. I checked it out. I called the direct number. It's real, Diane. The interview is real. Okay. She could hear Diane thinking. Okay. So something went right. Can you just let something go right? Lena lay back on the hotel bedspread and stared at the ceiling. I'm trying. You're lying there staring at the ceiling thinking about what the catch is. I'm not... She stopped. Maybe. There's no catch, Diane said firmly. You helped someone and a door stayed open that probably would have closed for anybody else. And that's not suspicious. It's just what happens when you've been doing the right thing for 30 years and the universe finally notices. She paused. Also, I fed Biscuit this morning, so she's fine. Don't worry about the cat. Lena smiled at the ceiling. Biscuit was a tabby with strong opinions and a vendetta against Lena's left sneaker. Thank you, Diane. Call me Thursday. After. I will. She didn't sleep particularly well that night either, which made 2 of them, though she didn't know that. The flight to Seattle on Thursday morning was economy, which she expected. She'd booked so many economy seats in her life that she knew exactly what to expect from them, knew to bring her own snacks and to take the aisle seat if possible because she got stiff if she couldn't stretch her legs during descent. What she did not expect was to arrive at the gate and have an agent approach her by name as she was settling into her seat near the window. Because someone else had asked to move and, they said, there was an available seat in the forward cabin if she'd prefer. They said it like it was a casual offer, a minor convenience, nothing worth making a fuss about. She knew it wasn't random. She also didn't know who to attribute it to, and the not knowing bothered her more than she let on. She took the seat because she wasn't stupid, and because she was tired, and because the forward cabin had more leg room, and she was about to walk into the most important professional conversation of her life, and she wanted to arrive with her spine uncramped. She spent the flight going over her notes. She'd printed them at the hotel business center the night before. 3 pages of talking points about the Foundation's existing programs, questions she wanted to ask about their 5-year strategy, specific ideas she had for expanding the Elder Companion Network into rural counties that currently had no coverage. She'd been building these ideas for months, ever since she first read the job description. She hadn't had anyone to practice with, so she'd practiced alone, speaking quietly into her own phone's voice memo app in the break room of the assisted living facility on slow evenings, then playing it back and listening for where she sounded nervous or vague. She sounded nervous in several places. She'd worked on those. By the time the plane descended into SeaTac, she'd read her notes 4 times and knew she would not need them anymore. The ideas were solid. The ideas had always been solid. She'd been doing this work on the ground for 6 years, and she knew things about what actually mattered in elder care that you couldn't learn from an administrative office in Portland. She knew which families fell through the gaps and why. She knew what caregivers needed that no one ever gave them. She knew what loneliness looked like in a 78-year-old man who'd outlived everyone he'd started with, and she knew what helped. She just had to convince a room full of people who didn't know her that she was worth betting on. The car that met her at arrivals was a standard black sedan. She'd been told there would be a car and she'd been vaguely uneasy about it, but it was ordinary enough. The driver, a quiet man named Marcus, who offered her a bottle of water and then left her to her thoughts, drove her to a building in downtown Seattle that she wouldn't have identified as particularly significant from the outside. Clean, professional, modest, actually, which she appreciated. Organizations that spent too much money on their lobbies made her nervous. Carol, the interview coordinator who'd confirmed her appointment by phone, met her in the lobby. She was a brisk, pleasant woman in her 50s who shook Lena's hand and walked her to a conference room on the 4th floor without unnecessary small talk, which Lena also appreciated. The conference room had a long table, a view of the Sound on a clear enough day, and it would have been a clear day. Seattle in November occasionally produced these small gifts. And 3 chairs arranged at one end, 2 facing one, and a glass of water already on the table in front of the single chair. "Someone will be with you shortly," Carol said. "Can I get you anything else?" "No, thank you. I'm fine." Carol left. Lena sat down in the single chair and straightened her jacket. The same navy blazer she'd worn on Tuesday, pressed again at the hotel the night before, and put her folder of notes on the table in front of her and then moved it slightly to the right, then moved it back. She looked at the window and the gray-blue water beyond it, and she thought about the man on the airport floor. She thought about his face, pale, still, frighteningly still, and she thought about pressing her fingers to his neck and feeling the pulse, faint and irregular, but there, and thinking, stay with me, as hard as she'd ever thought anything in her life. She hadn't known if he would. She still didn't know what had happened to him after the EMTs took over. She'd called the hospital that served O'Hare from the hotel, given what little information she had, elderly man, cardiac event, brought in Tuesday afternoon, and been told, politely and in compliance with patient privacy regulations, that they couldn't share information about patients. She'd expected that. She'd hung up and told herself that the EMTs had arrived in time, and that was enough to know. The door opened. 2 men walked in. One she didn't recognize. Tall, early 50s, dark jacket, the easy, confident posture of someone who'd been in boardrooms long enough to stop being intimidated by them. The other she did recognize, or thought she did, in the uncertain way you recognize someone you've seen once in entirely different circumstances. He was older. Considerably older. She put him in his early 80s, though he held himself straight, and his eyes, dark gray and sharp, had the alert quality of a mind that had not slowed down at the same rate as the body. He walked with a cane that he used efficiently, not leaning on it, but keeping it available. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him very well, and he had the kind of face that had been serious for so long that it had settled into a particular dignity. She knew that face. She was certain she knew it, though she couldn't place it immediately, and then something shifted in the geometry of the recognition, and she understood. The airport, the gray suit jacket, the arm outstretched on the floor. He was the man she'd stayed with. The shock of it hit her in a way she hadn't prepared for, which meant it hit her honestly. Her breath caught, her hands tightened on the folder in front of her, and she felt the color change in her face because she could feel the heat of it. She looked at him, and then looked away, and then looked back, because not looking would have been its own kind of lie. He sat down across from her, in one of the 2 chairs, and folded his hands on the table. The younger man sat in the chair beside him and said nothing. "Ms. Hayes," the older man said. His voice was low and unhurried. "My name is Victor Ashford. I'm the founder and primary benefactor of this foundation." He paused, giving her a moment with that. "And I believe you already know my face, even if you're just now placing where from." She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. "I do." "I want to say thank you," he said. "But I'm told you're here for a job interview, so perhaps we should do that first and the gratitude second. I find it's better not to mix the two." She didn't know what she'd expected him to say. Not that. She almost laughed, and it came out as a short exhale that might have been almost a laugh if she'd let it go a little further. "I appreciate that," she said. The younger man, who had not yet introduced himself, shifted slightly in his chair. There was something about him, too, something at the edge of familiarity, but she couldn't land on it and let it go. "I have some questions," Victor said, pulling a folder of his own from inside his jacket. Not asking if she was ready, just proceeding, which she preferred. "I've read your application twice. I want to understand how you think about this work, not just what you've done. The resume tells me you've been doing caregiving work for 6 years. It tells me the jobs you've held and the hours and the approximate scope. It doesn't tell me why you stayed doing it at that scale when you're clearly capable of more." She'd been asked versions of this question before, in smaller contexts, and she'd given versions of the polished answer that interviewers expected. The one about passion for the work, about wanting to make a difference, about being drawn to underserved populations. She heard herself starting to reach for that answer and stopped. "Because I was broke," she said, "and the work was available. And then I stayed because I was good at it, and I realized that good wasn't as common as I thought it should be." Victor's expression didn't change much, but something in it settled, like he'd been waiting for that version of the answer. "Good at which parts?" "Sitting with people," she said. "Not the clinical parts. I'm not a nurse. I'm not trained for medical intervention. But the other parts. The long afternoons when someone just needs another person in the room. The conversations that don't go anywhere but help anyway. Knowing when someone is scared but won't say so and just staying anyway." She paused. "And the logistics. I'm good at the logistics. The scheduling, the coordination, figuring out how to cover a gap with the resources available. I ran the companion rotation at Hillside for 2 years with 2 staff members and a lot of volunteers, and we didn't lose a single scheduled visit. That's not something most people know how to do." "Tell me about Hillside." She told him. She told him about the assisted living facility in Millhaven where she'd worked for 4 years, about the companion program she'd built from a suggestion in a meeting to an actual functioning schedule with 20 regular volunteers. She told him about the families who couldn't visit often enough, and the residents who stopped eating when they felt forgotten, and the specific things she'd learned about how to connect a volunteer with a resident so the relationship actually worked. It wasn't random. It was about matching temperaments, shared histories, compatible silences. Victor listened without interrupting, which was rare in Lena's experience of professional conversations. He let her finish her thoughts. He didn't nod encouragingly or write things down with obvious enthusiasm. He just listened, and the quality of his attention was such that she found herself saying things she hadn't planned to say because the space seemed to call for honesty rather than performance. "What would you do differently?" he asked. "If you had the resources of this foundation behind you, concretely, what changes?" She'd prepared for this one. She talked about the rural coverage gap, the counties within 50 miles of major cities that were statistically underserved because they weren't rural enough to qualify for rural assistance programs and weren't urban enough to have the institutional infrastructure. She talked about a 3-phase expansion model she'd sketched out over several evenings at the Millhaven Library using the Foundation's published data and census information. She talked about caregiver retention, which was the thing nobody wanted to address directly because it cost money. The chronic underpay and overwork that meant the best caregivers burned out or left the sector entirely within 3 years. "The work doesn't keep good people," she said, "not because the people aren't committed. They are, but commitment doesn't pay rent. You can care deeply about something and still have to leave it because you can't afford to stay. And then the people who needed you don't have you anymore. And the institutional knowledge you built over years walks out the door with you." She stopped. She hadn't intended to get that direct. "I know that's a bigger structural conversation than—" "No," Victor said. "That's the right conversation." He made a note for the first time. "What would you need to address it?" They talked for an hour and 40 minutes. The younger man spoke occasionally, asked 2 questions, both precise and genuinely curious rather than performative, and mostly listened. At some point, Carol came in with coffee, and Lena accepted it, and then forgot it was there, which she only noticed when she picked it up at the end and it was entirely cold. At the end, Victor closed his folder and folded his hands on top of it. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to hear it as true rather than as flattery, because I don't particularly do flattery." He paused. I was on the floor of that terminal for somewhere between 7 and 9 minutes before the medical team arrived. I was told afterwards that most of the people in that area walked away fairly quickly. A few stood and recorded on their phones. One man said he'd called for help and then moved to the other side of the seating area. He looked at her directly. And you stayed. You stayed for the whole time, and you talked to me even though I couldn't hear you, and you monitored my pulse, and you sent people for help, and you did all of that knowing, or not knowing, but certainly not stopping to calculate, that your flight was leaving. Lena didn't say anything. I'm not in the habit of equating a person's character with a single act, Victor continued. That's a shallow way to understand people. But the way you've spoken about this work today, the specifics of what you know and how you know it and what you do with more resources, that doesn't come from ambition. It comes from having actually cared about something for a long time. He paused. Those two things together are worth paying attention to. She looked down at her hands on the table for a moment, then back up at him. I didn't stay because I calculated anything, she said. I want to be clear about that. I didn't know it was your flight, or my flight, or anybody's flight. He was there and he needed someone to stay, and I stayed. She paused. I won't pretend the missed interview didn't hurt. It did. It really did. But that's a separate thing. Victor nodded slowly. Yes, he said. That's exactly what I mean. He stood, which she took as the signal that the interview was concluding, and she stood as well, and they shook hands. His grip was firmer than she'd expected for a man in his 80s. We'll be in touch, he said, formally, through the Foundation's process. I don't want you to feel that this conversation has already decided anything, because I don't think decisions made in an hour and 40 minutes are the right kind, but I wanted you to know that you were heard today. Thank you, she said, for the opportunity. Not because of what happened at the airport. I know that's not why I'm here. Victor looked at her for a moment. It's why you're here, he said simply. But it's not why you'd get the job. The younger man held the door for her as Carol came to escort her back to the lobby. In the hallway, before they parted ways, he said quietly, Good luck, Ms. Hayes. Just that. Nothing else. His expression was difficult to read, but there was something in it that felt genuine, the way some things just feel genuine despite having no particular reason to. She thanked him and followed Carol to the elevator. She didn't look back. In the lobby, waiting for Marcus to bring the car around, she stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the street. Seattle, in mid-morning, the light doing that particular thing it did in November, low and silver, and somehow both dim and sharp at the same time. Her hands were still. She noticed that because they hadn't been still in several days. She thought about Millhaven, the grocery store and the night shifts and the specific exhaustion of working 3 jobs for 11 months because the math of the flight required it. She thought about the day she'd sent in the application, sitting at the library computer, reading it over 3 times before hitting submit, because she didn't want to send something that wasn't exactly right. She thought about Diane saying, Can you just let something go right? She thought about an old man's pulse under her fingertips, faint but steady, staying. She didn't know what was going to happen. She'd learned a long time ago that not knowing was not the same as everything being uncertain. Some things you could feel the weight of, even before you knew their shape. This felt like something with weight. The car pulled up. She picked up her bag and went through the door. Marcus drove her back to the hotel in the same quiet way he'd driven her to the building. Water offered, radio off, no attempt at conversation. Lena appreciated it. She sat in the back seat and watched Seattle move past the window and tried to decide what she felt, which turned out to be harder than expected because what she felt was several things at once, and they didn't organize themselves into anything neat. She felt tired. That was the clearest one. The kind of tired that wasn't about sleep but about sustained tension finally releasing. The way your shoulders hurt more after you put a heavy bag down than while you were carrying it, because while you were carrying it, your body had committed to the weight and hadn't allowed itself to register the strain. She'd been carrying this particular weight for 11 months, and the interview was done now, and her shoulders, metaphorically speaking, ached. She also felt something that was not quite hope and not quite dread, but lived somewhere between them. Victor Ashford had said it's not why you'd get the job, and she'd understood what he meant. that the airport hadn't bought her anything, that the interview had to stand on its own, and she believed him, because he struck her as the kind of man who said what he meant with very little decoration. But she also knew she'd been good in that room. She'd been honest and specific, and she hadn't oversold herself or undersold herself. And the ideas she'd brought were real ideas built on real experience. And if that wasn't enough, then it wasn't enough. But she knew she'd done what she came to do. What she didn't know, what she was still turning over when Marcus pulled up to the hotel entrance, was the younger man. The one who'd sat beside Victor and asked 2 questions and held the door and said good luck, Ms. Hayes, in that quiet, genuine way. She'd placed his face somewhere during the elevator ride down, the recognition arriving late the way some recognitions do, soft and certain. The airport. He'd been there too. She'd seen him briefly. A tall man with a child's hand in his, slowing down in the aisle near the seating area. She'd barely registered him at the time because her attention had been entirely elsewhere, but he'd been there. She didn't know what to do with that information. She filed it in the part of her mind where she put things she couldn't resolve yet, and got out of the car and thanked Marcus and went inside. Her return flight to Portland, connecting to a bus to Millhaven, left at 6:40 the next morning. She had the afternoon and the evening, a hotel room she didn't have to pay for, and a city she'd never been to. She changed out of her blazer, put on her regular clothes, and went for a walk. Seattle in November was not what most people meant when they talked about beautiful cities. The tourist version of Seattle, the Pike Place Market in summer, the golden light on the Sound, the way the Olympic Mountains appeared on clear days like something painted on. That version was mostly absent in mid-November. What was left was the actual city, wet pavement and good coffee, and the particular energy of a place that had grown too fast and was still figuring out what it was. She walked for 2 hours without a destination and ended up sitting on a bench near the waterfront, eating a sandwich from a deli she'd found 3 blocks off the main drag, watching the ferries move across the gray water. She thought about what her life looked like from the outside. 30 years old, Millhaven, Oregon. 3 jobs, 1 cat, a bank account that had briefly contained $43. A rented room in a house she shared with 2 other people, a nursing student named Gabby, who kept strange hours, and an older man named Frank, who built birdhouses in the garage and left them on the porch railing for anyone to take. She liked Frank. She liked Gabby, too, in the careful way you like people you share walls with when the walls are thin. It wasn't a bad life. She wanted to be honest about that with herself because she'd met people who talked about their circumstances with a bitterness that had curdled into identity, and she didn't want that. The work she did was real work that mattered to real people. She was good at it. She just wanted more room, more scope. She'd outgrown the container she was in, and she'd known it for a while, and that wasn't ingratitude. It was just true. The sandwich was decent. The bread was a little stale on one end. She ate it anyway and watched the ferries and went back to the hotel. She was asleep by 9:30 and up at 4:15 and at SeaTac by 5:30 with her duffel bag and her blazer folded inside it and 3 pages of notes she no longer needed. She bought a coffee from the only open kiosk and found her gate and sat down and called Diane. "Well?" Diane answered, which was how Diane answered every call when she was expecting information. "It went well, I think. I don't know. It went well." "Tell me everything." She told her about Victor. She hesitated before she told her about recognizing him, because saying it out loud made it sound like something out of a story she wouldn't have believed if someone else told it to her. But she told Diane anyway because Diane was the person she told things to. "He was the man from the airport," she said. Silence. "Diane." "I'm processing," Diane said. "Give me a second." A pause. "Lena, that man is Victor Ashford." "I know." "Do you know who Victor Ashford is? Like, do you actually know?" "I know he founded the foundation and an airline company," Patrick mentioned. "Lena, he founded Meridian Air. He's one of the wealthiest philanthropists in the country. There are buildings with his name on them, like actual buildings." Lena looked at her gate number. "I didn't know that part." "You knelt on an airport floor for Victor Ashford." "I knelt on an airport floor for an old man who needed someone to stay," she said. "I didn't know who he was." "I know," Diane said, and her voice had changed, softer now, less processing, and more genuine. I know you didn't. That's the thing, isn't it? A pause. How are you feeling? I don't know. Strange. A little like the ground isn't quite level. That's reasonable. I keep waiting for the part where it turns out to be something other than what it seems. What does it seem like? Lena looked out the terminal window at the tarmac, dark still, the runway lights blinking in long, patient rows. It seems like maybe something is about to change, she said, and I don't know if I trust that yet. You don't have to trust it, Diane said. You just have to let it happen. The flight boarded. She hung up and found her seat and slept for most of the hour to Portland, which surprised her. She hadn't thought she'd be able to. She was back in Millhaven by noon. The call from Carol came 8 days later. Not 7, not 5, 8, which felt like a long time to wait for something, and also, in retrospect, exactly long enough. Lena was in the break room at the assisted living facility, eating leftover rice from a container she'd brought from home, and reading a funding report she'd found online about caregiver wage initiatives in 3 Pacific Northwest counties, when her phone rang with a number she'd saved under Hartwell Foundation. Carol. She put the rice down. Miss Hayes, this is Carol Eng from the Hartwell Foundation. Do you have a few minutes? Yes, Lena said. Her voice was steady. She was mildly surprised by that. The board has completed its deliberations regarding the Director of Community Outreach position. I'm calling to let you know that the foundation would like to offer you the role. The break room was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere down the hallway, she could hear one of the residents, Mr. Petrosky, who had strong feelings about the thermostat, conducting a one-sided conversation with a staff member about the temperature being unreasonable. The offer includes a formal letter outlining salary, benefits, and start date, Carol continued. We'd like to have you in Seattle within 6 weeks if possible, but the timeline is negotiable depending on your circumstances. Do you have questions you'd like to ask now, or would you prefer to review the written offer first? Lena stopped, started again. Yes, I have questions, but I'd like to see the letter first if that's all right. Of course, I'll send it to your email within the hour. Thank you, Carol. Congratulations, Ms. Hayes. She hung up and sat very still in the break room for approximately 90 seconds. Then she picked up her rice and finished eating it, because it was going to get cold. And cold leftover rice was one of her least favorite things, and she had 3 hours left on her shift. She told exactly 2 people that day, Mr. Petrosky, who she ran into in the hallway 5 minutes later, and who responded by shaking her hand formally and saying, about time someone recognized sense when they saw it, which she decided to take as a compliment, and Diane, who screamed into her phone loudly enough that Lena had to hold it away from her ear and then laughed for a long time. She did not tell anyone else. Not yet. She wanted to sit with it first, the way you sit with something that's real before you let other people's reactions start to shape how you experience it. The offer letter was thorough and fair, and the salary was more than twice what she made at the 3 jobs combined, which caused her to read that particular line 4 times to make sure she was reading it correctly. She was. She sat at her kitchen table with the letter printed out in front of her and a cup of tea going cold beside it, and she looked at the number and thought about 11 months of grocery store night shifts, and she didn't cry, because she wasn't someone who cried easily, but she put both hands flat on the table and pressed them down like she needed to feel something solid. She accepted the offer the next morning. What she didn't know, in those 8 days between the interview and the call, was what had happened in the room after she left. Victor had sat for a few minutes after Lena was escorted out, not reviewing his notes or checking his phone, just sitting. Declan had waited. He'd learned over 11 years of knowing Victor Ashford that the man's silences were not empty. They were the opposite of empty. They were where his thinking happened, and interrupting them was both rude and counterproductive. She didn't mention it, Victor said finally. I noticed. She could have. The whole interview. She had an opening when she talked about why she'd stayed in direct care work. She could have said something like, well, I also recently helped someone in an emergency. I think that speaks to my character. And I would have understood it. Most people would have found a way to mention it. She didn't mention it once, Declan said. No. Victor picked up his pen and set it down again. She also didn't talk about the missed interview in a way that asked for sympathy. I was watching for that. Some people would have worked it into the conversation, the sacrifice they'd made, the difficulty of the situation. She mentioned it once, factually, when I asked directly, and then she moved on. What are you thinking? Victor looked at the window. I'm thinking that character is the rarest thing, he said, and the most difficult to fake over the course of an hour and 40 minutes when someone is actually paying attention. He paused. I want to offer her the position. You don't want to see the other candidates first? I've seen them. 3 of the 6 I interviewed before she came in. The other 2 I'll see tomorrow. He looked at Declan. But I already know. Declan was quiet for a moment. You're sure this is about the interview and not about what happened at the airport? No, Victor said plainly. I'm not sure, and that uncertainty matters, which is why I'm going to see the other candidates tomorrow, regardless, and why I'm not going to make any decision until I've sat with it for a week. He paused. But I think I'm sure. He saw the other 2 candidates the next day. He came out of both interviews and called Declan that evening. It's her, he said, without preamble. Okay. The others are qualified. One of them is very qualified, actually. 15 years in nonprofit management. Ran a regional housing fund in Arizona. Sharp, prepared, knows the numbers cold. He paused. But she talked about the work like it was a career. Lena Hayes talks about it like it's something that happened to her. Like she didn't choose caregiving so much as she found herself in it and realized she was good at it and decided to stay. Another pause. That sounds like less. It's more. Are you going to tell her who I am? Declan asked. When you make the offer. Do you want her to know? He thought about it. He thought about what had happened in the days since O'Hare, the phone calls, the research, the decision to reach out, the flight booking and the hotel and the car and all the pieces of infrastructure that Patrick had quietly assembled around a woman who didn't know any of it existed. He thought about whether she would want to know or whether knowing would change the thing he was trying to preserve, the integrity of what she'd earned and how she'd earned it. Not yet, he said. She should get settled in the role first. Let the job be hers before she finds out how the door opened. And if she finds out on her own? Then she finds out on her own, he said, and we deal with that honestly. Victor made a sound that might have been approval. You've been thinking about this a great deal. My daughter asked about her again last weekend, Declan said. She wanted to know if the lady from the airport was okay. And what did you tell her? I told her she was going to be. A short silence. Then Victor said, You know this foundation work is going to intersect with your own. The programs I'm building have overlap with the elder care initiatives in your family foundation's portfolio. You'll likely be in the same room as her within the first 6 months. I know. That's going to require some careful navigation. I know that too. You're not worried about it. I'm a little worried about it, Declan said. I just think it's the right order of things. Job first. Stability first. Everything else after. Victor seemed to consider this. She deserves to know that someone saw her, he said quietly, not as a charity case, as a person worth noticing. She'll know, Declan said. Eventually. The 6 weeks before Lena's start date were not elegant. Moving from Millhaven to Seattle on a timeline was the kind of logistical undertaking that revealed all the seams in a life. She gave 2 weeks' notice at all 3 jobs, which produced 3 different reactions. The assisted living facility threw her a small party in the break room with a sheet cake that said, "Good luck, Lena," in blue frosting and slightly uneven letters, and Mr. Petrowski shook her hand again and told her she'd better not forget where she came from, which she took not as a warning, but as a send-off. The grocery store manager shook her hand and said he was sorry to lose her, and she believed him because he was a decent man who ran a decent store and had accommodated her schedule for 3 years without complaint. The home companion agency sent her an automated email thanking her for her service and wishing her well, which was fine. She hadn't expected more. Frank came out of the garage when she was loading the last boxes into the rented van. She was driving to Seattle herself, which was both cheaper and better because she wanted the drive, wanted the physical distance accumulating under her as something she'd made herself. And he stood on the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the van. "You're really going," he said. "I'm really going." Good. He nodded, like this was something he'd been waiting for. You're too good for this town. I like this town, she said. You can like it from Seattle, he said, and went back into the garage. There was a birdhouse on the porch railing the morning she left. She hadn't seen him put it there. It was a simple design, cedar, painted dark green, a small round hole in the front, and a hook at the top for hanging. She stood and looked at it for a moment, then carefully wrapped it in one of her sweaters and put it in the back of the van. The drive to Seattle was 4 hours, and she did it straight through, stopping once for gas and a terrible cup of coffee at a station outside Olympia, arriving at her new apartment. A one-bedroom in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, small but clean, with a radiator that worked and a window over the kitchen sink that looked out at a brick wall she'd already decided she liked. In the early afternoon. She unloaded the van herself. It took 4 trips, and she pulled something in her left shoulder on the 3rd trip and had to be careful with the last one. But she got everything inside. She hung Frank's birdhouse on a hook by the window. It looked wrong there. Birdhouses were for outdoors, but she kept it anyway. Biscuit, who had made the drive in a carrier on the passenger seat and registered her displeasure with the entire situation via 11 straight minutes of vocal protest somewhere around Centralia, emerged from the carrier when Lena opened the apartment door and immediately began a territorial inspection of every corner, her tail straight up, her expression severe. By evening, she had claimed the radiator area as her domain and gone to sleep there with the satisfied solidity of a creature who had made her decision and committed to it. Lena made tea in a kitchen where she didn't know yet which cabinet things went in and sat on the floor because the couch wasn't arriving until Saturday and leaned against the wall and looked at the room. Empty. Hers. She thought about the sequence of things, the job posting 3 months ago, the application, the months of preparation, the night shifts and the library visits and the voice memos in the break room, the flight, the airport, a man on the floor, the pulse under her fingers, the departures board. And then, somehow, here. She didn't understand all of it. She'd stopped expecting to. Some sequences of events didn't resolve into a lesson or a moral. They just resolved into what happened next. And what happened next was a one-bedroom apartment in Seattle, and a job that meant something, and a birdhouse on the wall, and a cat asleep by the radiator. She was okay with that. Her first day at the Hartwell Foundation was a Monday in January, cold and overcast in the way Seattle Januaries reliably were. And she arrived 12 minutes early because she was that kind of person, and probably always would be. Carol met her at the door and walked her through the building. The staff she'd be working with, the offices, the conference rooms she'd use for team meetings. There were 11 people in the Seattle office, ranging from a data analyst named Thomas, who spoke almost exclusively in percentages, and was apparently very good at his job, to an outreach coordinator named Priya, who had a master's in social work and a laugh that carried through 2 closed doors, and who told Lena within the first hour that she was glad she'd gotten the position because the 2 male candidates they'd interviewed had both seemed like they'd never actually met a person over 70. "How'd you know about the other candidates?" Lena asked. "Thomas talks when he thinks no one is listening," Priya said, "and I listen when people think I'm not." Lena decided she liked Priya. Victor came in on her 3rd day. She didn't know he was coming. Carol hadn't mentioned it, and she looked up from the rural coverage data she'd been mapping to find him in the doorway of her office with his cane and his charcoal suit and his particular quality of stillness. "You've already moved the furniture," he said, looking at the desk, which she'd shifted to face the window rather than the door. "I think better when I can see outside," she said. "I hope that's all right." "This is your office," he said, like the question was mildly confusing to him. He came in and sat in the chair across from her desk, the same arrangement as the interview, more or less, except reversed. "How's the first week?" "Good," she said. "Real. The rural gap data is worse than I thought in 2 of the counties I'm looking at, but that also means there's more room to build." "That's an interesting way to look at a problem." "It's the only useful way," she said, and then wondered if that sounded presumptuous. From his expression, it didn't. He stayed for 40 minutes. He asked about the data, about her initial read of the team, about what she thought the Foundation's biggest structural weakness was after 3 days of internal access. That last question surprised her enough that she answered it honestly instead of carefully. She said the program documentation was inconsistent across regional partners, which made it hard to evaluate what was actually working versus what just looked good on quarterly reports. He didn't look offended. He made a note. "That's been a problem for 2 years," he said. "No one on the staff has said it directly until now." Maybe they didn't want to seem critical in the first week. "And you?" She looked at him. "I came here to do the work. If the work needs me to say the uncomfortable thing, I'm going to say the uncomfortable thing." He nodded. "Good." He stood, retrieved his cane. "One more thing. There's a quarterly partner convening in March. I'd like you to lead it." "I've been here 3 days." "I know. Lead it anyway." He left. She sat in her chair for a moment looking at the space where he'd been. Then she turned back to the rural coverage map and made a note about the quarterly convening and kept working. What she didn't know was that Declan had been in the building that morning. Not in her office, not anywhere near her floor. He'd been in a meeting with Victor and 2 members of the Foundation's Financial Advisory Board about a joint initiative between his family foundation and the Hartwell programs, a collaboration that had been in early stages for several months, and that his team referred to internally as the Bridge Project, which was a placeholder name they'd all agreed was boring, but no one had replaced yet. The meeting had run 90 minutes and covered budget architecture and regional scope and evaluation metrics, all of which were Declan's natural habitat, and he'd been engaged and useful and had said approximately 15 things of substance. He had not gone to the 4th floor. He'd decided, in the elevator on the way up that morning, that the right thing to do was to let her settle. The job was hers. The work was hers. He'd done what he'd set out to do, which was make sure the door stayed open, and now the door was open and she was walking through it, and what happened next was her story to write, not his to observe. He told himself this firmly and believed most of it. He did ask Patrick, in the car on the way back to his office, how her first week seemed to be going. "I don't have surveillance on the woman," Patrick said. "I'm not asking for surveillance. I'm asking if you've heard anything." "From whom?" "My network of Hartwell Foundation informants." "Patrick." "She's fine," Patrick said. "Carol mentioned to the Foundation's external communications contact, who is also on our media list, that the new outreach director was already restructuring the rural data assessment, which means she's working, which means she's fine." Declan looked out the window. "Good. For what it's worth," Patrick said, "I think the way you handled this was not unhinged. That's a strong endorsement coming from you. It's the strongest I've got for something I initially described as mildly unhinged." He paused. "She earned it. You just made sure the accounting was fair." Declan didn't say anything. The car moved through the Seattle streets, wet and gray and ordinary, and he thought about a woman kneeling on an airport floor and choosing to stay, and the specific cost of that choice, and the specific shape of what it had opened. He thought about Maisie asking if she was going to be okay. He thought about Professor the Rabbit, standing sentinel on a pillow, mildly optimistic. "Yeah," he thought, "she is." The March convening happened on a Thursday, which was the kind of day Seattle occasionally produced in early spring. Not warm, not sunny, but with a quality of light that was different from January's gray. Something slightly looser and more tentative, like the city was considering the possibility of better weather without committing to it. Lena had been preparing for 6 weeks, not obsessively. She still had her regular work, the rural coverage expansion she'd been building with Thomas and his percentages, the documentation standardization she'd proposed in her first week, and that Victor had quietly approved 3 days later, the partner calls and the site visits, and the ordinary accumulating weight of a new job taken seriously. But the convening had been running in the background of everything else. A parallel project she returned to in the evenings and on Saturday mornings with her second cup of coffee, building the agenda piece by piece, thinking about what the regional partners actually needed from a quarterly meeting versus what they'd been getting. What they'd been getting, based on 2 years of meeting notes she'd pulled from the Foundation's shared drive, was a lot of reporting and not much conversation. Slide decks from the central office, updates on funding allocations, Q&A that ran short because nobody wanted to be the person asking the difficult question in a room full of colleagues they needed to keep good relationships with. She understood the dynamic. She'd been on the other side of it enough times. The caregiver in the room full of administrators staying quiet because staying quiet was safer. She restructured the entire day. Less reporting, more working sessions. She sent the regional partners their own data 2 weeks in advance, their outcomes, their gaps, their numbers compared to regional averages, so that the meeting itself didn't have to be about what the situation was, but about what to do about it. She built in a block she called an open floor, which was exactly what it sounded like. 45 minutes with no agenda, no facilitator notes, just the question, what do you need that you're not getting written on the whiteboard at the front of the room? Priya had looked at the draft agenda and said, some of these people have been coming to this convening for 2 years. They're going to be resistant to the format change. Probably, Lena said. The Cascadia partner in particular, Ruth Okafor, she's been running her regional program since the foundation started, and she has opinions about process. Good. I want her opinions about process. That's the point. Priya had looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating. Okay, she said. Yeah, okay. 14 regional partners attended in person. 3 joined remotely. Victor came and sat at the back of the room, which Lena noticed when she was setting up at 7:30, and which she registered and then consciously set aside because she couldn't run a meeting well if she was performing for the person in the back row. Ruth Okafor was, as advertised, a woman with opinions. She was 61, direct in the way that people who've been doing difficult work for a long time often become direct. Not harsh, not dismissive, but economical, with a low tolerance for language that sounded like something without being something. She pushed back on the open floor format within the first 10 minutes of Lena's introduction. We've had open discussions before, she said from her seat near the window. They tend to produce a lot of talking and not much follow-through. I know, Lena said. I read the notes from the last 8 quarters. The follow-through has been inconsistent. I want to talk about why that is, which is part of why I changed the format. Ruth looked at her for a moment. You read 8 quarters of meeting notes. I wanted to understand what had already been tried. A short pause. All right, Ruth said and sat back. The morning sessions were not seamless. The data review with Thomas produced 2 moments of genuine tension. One when a partner from the Eastern Oregon region pushed back on how their outcomes were being measured, arguing that the Foundation's metrics didn't capture the kind of work they did with isolated rural populations. And one when the conversation about documentation standards got heated enough that Lena had to actively redirect it, which she did without shutting it down because the heat was coming from a real place, and real heat was more useful than polite agreement. The Eastern Oregon partner's name was Daniel Reyes. He was 40-something, had been running a companion program in a 3-county area for 4 years. And he was right about the metrics. Not entirely right. There were parts of his argument that conflated correlation with causation in ways Thomas quietly flagged, but substantively right about the core problem. Lena let him make the full argument before responding. You're describing something real, she said. The standard outcome measures we're using were designed for urban and suburban programs. They don't account for the travel time component in rural coverage, which means the staff efficiency numbers look worse than they are without context. She looked at Thomas. Can we build a contextual index into the reporting template? Thomas said, yes, but it'll take me about 3 weeks. Fine. Daniel, if I send you a draft of what that looks like in week 3, would you be willing to review it from your end? Daniel Reyes looked at her with the slightly suspicious expression of someone who was used to being agreed with in meetings and then ignored in practice. Yeah, he said. I would. The open floor session, which Lena had quietly been most anxious about, turned out to be the part that worked best. It took about 8 minutes of uncomfortable silence after she wrote the question on the whiteboard. What do you need that you're not getting? Before someone spoke, and that someone was Ruth Okafor, which surprised Lena a little and probably shouldn't have. More lead time on funding decisions, Ruth said. When allocations shift, we need 90 days minimum. We've been getting 30, sometimes less. I can't manage staffing on 30 days. Noted, Lena said, and wrote it. Someone else. Translation support for partner outreach materials. We have 3 languages in our service population, and we're doing our own translations with Google Translate, which is it's not good. Noted. Someone else. A direct line for urgent situations, not the main foundation number. An actual person who picks up when a partner program has an emergency. Noted. By the end of the 45 minutes, the whiteboard had 11 items on it, and the room had a different quality than it had at the start. Something more like a working group and less like an audience. Victor, at the back of the room, had not said a single word all day. Lena hadn't looked at him directly since the morning. At the close of the day, 4:15, the light outside doing that tentative early spring thing against the conference room windows, she stood at the front of the room and went through the 11 items on the whiteboard one by one. For each one, she said either, "This is something we can address, here's how, and here's a timeline," or "This is something I need to take back to the foundation's leadership, and I'll have an answer within 30 days," or "This is outside the foundation's current scope, but I want to document it because scope should respond to need and not the other way around." Ruth Okafor stopped her as the room was clearing out. "The documentation standardization," she said. "You started that in your first week." "Yes. Victor told me you'd flagged it in your third day." "It seemed like the most urgent thing." Ruth looked at her, not quite evaluating, something more like confirming. "How long were you in direct care work before this?" 6 years. "It shows," Ruth said. Not as a compliment exactly, more as an observation. "You ask the right questions, not the questions that make the foundation look good, the ones that make the work better." "Those should be the same questions," Lena said. Ruth almost smiled. "They should be," she said. "They usually aren't." She picked up her bag. "Good convening. First time in 2 years I've felt like it was worth the drive." She left. Lena stood in the emptying room and felt the specific quiet that comes after a sustained effort. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of stillness. The room going back to being a room instead of a thing she was responsible for. Victor appeared beside her. She hadn't heard him cross the room, which was slightly startling for a man with a cane. 11 items, he said, looking at the whiteboard. 11 items. How many can you realistically address in the next quarter? 7, she said. 8 if Thomas works fast, which he usually does. And the other 3 or 4? They're not going to disappear because I didn't get to them in 90 days. I'll carry them. He looked at the whiteboard for another moment. Ruth Okafor hasn't said a convening was worth the drive in 2 years, he said. She told me. She wouldn't have told you if she didn't want you to know she meant it, he said. Ruth does not say things she doesn't mean. I got that impression, he nodded. The lead time problem on funding allocations. That's a legitimate criticism of how we've been operating. I want you to bring a proposal to the board next month, not the regional partners' complaints. A concrete proposal for a new protocol. I'll have it in 2 weeks. He turned to look at her. You don't have to have everything done in 2 weeks, Ms. Hayes. I know, she said, but I'm faster when I have something to work toward. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. Then he said, Go home. You've been here since 7:30. She went home. She ate leftover soup from a container in her refrigerator and sat on the couch. The couch had arrived from Portland in February, slightly battered from the move and listing a little to the left, and Biscuit climbed onto her lap with the proprietary confidence of a cat who had decided that laps were a resource she personally administered. She sat there for an hour without doing anything in particular, which was unusual for her and felt like something she'd earned. She thought about the 11 items on the whiteboard. She thought about Daniel Reyes's metric argument and Ruth Okafor's 2-year absence of good convenings, and Priya's laugh carrying through closed doors, and Thomas, who had quietly been supportive in every meeting without making noise about it, who had flagged 3 errors in her rural coverage model in the first week and been right about all 3. She thought about the fact that she liked this job, not in the way you like something because it pays well or because it impresses people. She hadn't told many people about it yet beyond Diane and Frank had responded by nodding slowly and saying, Goodwood, that job, in the way he talked about his birdhouses, which she'd taken as high praise. She liked it in the specific way you like something when you can feel yourself being the right size for it, when the container fits. What she didn't think about, deliberately, was the question of how she'd gotten here. She'd made her peace with the sequence of things. The airport, the floor, the pulse under her fingers, the departures board, the rescheduled interview, Victor's face in the conference room. She'd made peace with all of it in the way you make peace with something by deciding to move forward rather than by resolving all the questions it raises. There were still things she didn't fully understand, things at the edges of the story that didn't quite add up if she pressed them. How had the Foundation known to call her? Who had found her prepaid number? Why the upgrade at the gate? She'd asked Carol once, obliquely, and Carol had said the Foundation's executive team had been very engaged in making sure the situation was addressed, which was technically an answer, and also wasn't. She'd stopped pressing. Pressing was for situations where the answer would change what you did next, and nothing she could learn about the mechanics of how the door opened would change the fact that she'd walked through it and the work was real, and she intended to do it well. She pressed Biscuit's head instead, gently, and Biscuit tolerated this for approximately 4 seconds before moving to the other end of the couch. The Bridge Project meeting happened on a Wednesday in late March, 6 weeks after the convening, on a morning that had finally made good on the spring weather's tentative promise. Actual sun, the kind that required you to tilt the blinds in the conference rooms because the glare hit the screens. Lena had been included on the project 3 weeks earlier when Victor had forwarded her an email chain with a one-line note. "This is relevant to your rural expansion work. Loop yourself in." She'd read the chain, understood the scope, a joint initiative between the Hartwell Foundation and an external family foundation, focused on elder care service delivery in underserved communities, combining Hartwell's program infrastructure with the external foundation's capital and distribution networks, and had sent 3 pages of notes to the project lead within 48 hours. The project lead, a woman named Serena who worked in the foundation's strategic partnerships office and who communicated almost entirely in calendar invites, had responded with a meeting request, and the comment, "These are actually useful notes. Thank you." The meeting was in the main conference room. Lena arrived at 8:50 for a 9 o'clock start, found Thomas already there with his laptop and a coffee so large it constituted a structural element, and took the seat beside him. Priya came in at 8:58, slightly out of breath, and sat across from them. Carol arranged water glasses at intervals along the table with the calm precision she brought to all logistics. At 9:02, the door opened and 2 people came in from the external foundation's side. Lena was reviewing her notes on the rural expansion model and looked up when the door opened and her brain did the thing it had done in the interview room 3 months ago. The delayed recognition, the geometry reassembling itself into something she already knew. He was taller than she remembered, or the room made him seem so. He was with a woman she didn't recognize, 30s, efficient-looking, a laptop bag over one shoulder, who was already scanning the table and assessing seat logistics. He was looking at the table too, at the agenda printout in front of the empty chair across from Lena, and he hadn't looked up yet. Then he did. The recognition was mutual and immediate. She saw it happen in his face. Not quite surprise, something more controlled than surprise, but a shift nonetheless. The expression of someone encountering a thing they'd thought they were prepared for and finding the preparation incomplete. He sat down, across from her. "Ms. Hayes," he said. His voice was level. "I don't think we've been formally introduced. Declan Whitmore." She looked at him steadily. The airport, the tall man with the child's hand. The way he'd slowed in the aisle, and then the flight had boarded and she'd lost track of him in the way you lose track of peripheral things when the central thing is all-consuming. "Lena Hayes," she said. "I think we've been in the same room before." "We have," he said. He didn't elaborate. He set his own folder on the table and she noticed he kept his expression careful in the way people keep expressions careful when they're aware they're being observed closely. Serena called the meeting to order before either of them could say anything else. The meeting was about the Bridge Project's rural pilot phase, specifically about which counties to prioritize, how to structure the partner selection process, and what the evaluation framework would look like in the first 18 months. These were exactly the things Lena had been thinking about for weeks, and within 10 minutes she was engaged in the work, and the strangeness of who was across the table had receded to a background frequency she could manage. He was good in the meeting. She noticed that objectively, the way you notice competence when you're working alongside it. He asked precise questions. When she walked through the rural expansion model she'd built with Thomas, he asked about the travel time variable she'd added to the metrics, the contextual index that Thomas had finished the week before. And she explained it, and he understood it immediately and asked a follow-up that pushed the model's assumptions in a useful direction. And she answered it, and they were briefly just two people thinking about the same problem from adjacent angles, and the problem got slightly better for it. The partner selection criteria, he said at one point. You're proposing a site visit component before any funding agreement. Yes. That adds 8 to 12 weeks to the process for each partner. I know. I think it's worth it. The documentation problem we've been working on, inconsistent reporting, outcomes that look better or worse than they are depending on how they're being measured, a lot of that comes from partnerships where the foundation didn't fully understand what it was funding before it funded it. She paused. 8 weeks up front saves 18 months of course correcting. He looked at her for a moment. That's a reasonable argument. It's also just a true one, she said. Thomas made a sound that was almost a laugh and then turned it into a cough. Priya looked at the ceiling. The meeting ran 2.5 hours. Toward the end, when the major decisions had been made and the remaining discussion had relaxed into logistics and timeline details, the woman who'd come in with Declan, his assistant Patrick, Lena later learned, and she'd been wrong about the gender on the initial read, leaned over and said something quietly to him that made him glance at his phone and nod. When the meeting ended and people began gathering folders and refilling water glasses and having the small side conversations that collect at the end of formal meetings, Declan stood and looked at Lena across the table. Do you have a minute? He said. Not demanding, just asking. She looked at him. Yes, she said. The others filed out. Thomas gave her an entirely neutral look as he left that communicated nothing and everything. Priya glanced back once from the door. They were alone in the conference room. The sun had shifted and wasn't hitting the screens anymore. The room felt different with just two people in it, smaller or maybe more honest. I owe you an explanation, he said. He remained standing, which she appreciated. It felt like a posture of accountability rather than comfort. You were at the airport, she said. Yes. And you knew Victor. For 11 years. He's been a mentor. I recognized him when the EMTs arrived. I didn't know it was him while it was happening. I was too far back and moving through. I only realized when I called him afterward. She processed this. You called him. To make sure he was all right. And then I realized who he was and what the foundation was, and he stopped, started again. I didn't engineer the interview. I want to be clear about that. You'd already applied. You were already in the final round. What I did was ask Victor to make sure the door was still open after the flight left. That's all. She looked at him. Patrick Calloway. A pause. He works for me. Yes. The hotel. The flight. Yes. She sat back in her chair. Not in anger. She wasn't sure what she felt, actually, and she wanted to be accurate about it. There was something that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't nothing. There was also something that wasn't gratitude exactly, but was adjacent to it in the uncomfortable way that gratitude sometimes is, when the thing you're grateful for also came with conditions you didn't know about. Why didn't you tell me? She said. Because I didn't want it to be about what I did, he said. I wanted it to be about what you did. In the interview, in the work. He paused. I watched you in that meeting today. The site visit argument, the metric index. You got that job because you're good at it, Ms. Hayes, not because of anything I did. That might be true, she said. And I still had a right to know that someone was moving pieces around. Yes, he said. You did. I made the wrong call on timing. I thought if you knew before you were settled in the role, it would change how you understood what you'd earned. And I was trying to protect that. I was wrong to make that decision for you. She looked at him for a moment. He held the look without flinching and without performing contrition, which she found more credible than either of the alternatives would have been. You have a daughter, she said. It wasn't a question. Something in his face shifted. Yes. Maisie, she's 6. She was at the airport. She was. She asked about me, Lena said. Not as an accusation, just as something she'd been told, piecing it together now. Victor had said something, months ago, about the people who'd been watching. She hadn't thought about it carefully enough at the time. She asked if you were going to be okay, Declan said. Several times. She doesn't let things go. Lena looked at the table, then at the window. The sun was doing something decent outside, moving through the early spring air in a way that didn't commit to warmth but gestured toward it. "You should have told me," she said again. "Not in the beginning, but before today." "I know. I don't like having the shape of my own story explained to me late." "That's fair. Is there anything else I don't know?" He thought about it, which she appreciated. She could have done without a quick, reflexive no. "Victor was going to offer you the position regardless of my involvement," he said. "I was there when he decided. He interviewed the other candidates. He chose you because of who you are in the work, not because of the airport. I genuinely believe that." "Victor can tell me that himself," she said. "He will. If you ask him, he will." She stood, gathered her folder. He was still standing across the table, and she looked at him directly. Not warmly, not coldly, just honestly, the way she looked at problems she intended to understand before she decided what to do with them. "The bridge project," she said. "The rural pilot. Your foundation's involvement, is that going to be a recurring working relationship?" "Likely yes, depending on how the pilot goes." "Then we're going to need to be able to work together without this sitting in the room." "I agree." "I need a day to think about this," she said. "Not about the job or about Victor. I'm clear on both of those. Just about," she stopped, "about the shape of it. How I understand what happened." "Take whatever time you need," he said. "And Ms. Hayes," he paused. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. That's not contingent on anything. It's just true." She looked at him one more moment. Then she picked up her folder and her water glass and walked to the door. In the hallway, Priya was very conspicuously not waiting for her. She was standing at the end of the corridor looking at a framed photograph on the wall with entirely too much interest. "Interesting meeting," Priya said, not looking away from the photograph. "Don't," Lena said. "I'm just saying." "I know what you're just saying." Priya fell into step beside her as they walked toward the elevator. "Are you okay?" Lena pressed the elevator button. "I'm thinking." "That's usually a yes." "It's usually a not yet," Lena said, "which is different." The elevator opened. They got in. Priya very carefully did not say anything else for 4 floors, which was an impressive act of restraint and one Lena appreciated more than she said. She did speak to Victor that afternoon, not in a formal meeting. She knocked on the door of his office, which he used when he was in Seattle, about 2 hours after the bridge project meeting ended. He was reading something when she knocked, and he looked up without surprise, like he'd been expecting this visit on some general timeline, even if not this specific hour. She said, "I know." He closed his folder. "How much?" "Enough. Declan told me in the conference room." "Ah." He set his reading glasses on the desk. "He told you today." "Yes." "He should have told you sooner." "That's what I said." Victor looked at her steadily. "Do you want to know my version?" "Yes." He told her. All of it. The EMTs, the hospital, what he'd been told about the woman who'd stayed, the call from Declan the next morning. He told her about his decision to conduct the rescheduled interview himself. He told her about the other 2 candidates and what he'd concluded after seeing them. He told her that his decision to offer her the position was his alone, and that he would put that in writing if she wanted it. "I don't need it in writing," she said. "What do you need?" She thought about it. "I need to know that this job is mine to keep or lose on my own from here, that the floor in the airport has been accounted for and closed out." "It has been," he said. "It was accounted for the day I asked Patrick Calloway to make that first call. Everything since then has been yours." She nodded. "One more thing," Victor said. "What you did in that terminal, I have not found a way to adequately address it. I don't know that I can. You gave a stranger 7 minutes of complete attention at significant personal cost, and you didn't expect anything from it. That's not something I can put on a ledger." He paused. "But I can tell you that it mattered, not because of what followed, just because of what it was." Lena looked at him. This was the kind of thing that, in other mouths, would have sounded like a speech. In Victor's, it just sounded like something he'd thought about for a long time and finally said. "I know," she said. Then, "Thank you for seeing it." She went back to her office. She spent 2 hours on the rural coverage model and then sent Thomas 3 questions about the contextual index that would probably keep him busy until Friday. Then she packed up at 6, took the elevator down, walked out into the early spring evening, and called Diane from the sidewalk. "Something happened today," she said. "Good or bad?" She thought about it, the conference room, the shape of the story as she now understood it, Victor's face across the table, Declan standing, not sitting, because it was a posture of accountability. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, but I think I'm okay." "That's usually enough," Diane said. "Yeah," Lena said. "I think it is." She started walking. The evening air was cold and clean, and the street was full of the ordinary end-of-day motion of a city settling into itself, and she walked through it with her bag on her shoulder and her folder under her arm, and the specific feeling of someone who has looked at the full shape of a thing and decided to keep going anyway. She didn't call Declan back that week, or the week after. She wasn't avoiding him exactly. She showed up to the bridge project working sessions, sat across from him or adjacent to him depending on the room configuration, engaged with the work directly and without visible awkwardness. She was professional in the truest sense of the word, which meant she kept what was personal separate from what was practical. And when the work required her to push back on one of his proposals, she pushed back without hesitation. And when his contributions were good, she said so. And neither of them made the conference room conversation into something they referenced in those settings. But she didn't reach out. She needed the time, and she was honest enough with herself to know why. The thing she was working through wasn't anger, though there had been a version of it in the conference room that day. A quick, clean flash of it when she'd understood the full shape of what had happened. Not because she'd been deceived exactly, but because the story she'd been telling herself about how she'd gotten here turned out to have more people in it than she'd known. She'd believed she had walked through that door largely on her own, on the strength of the interview and what she'd said in it. And that was still true. Victor had confirmed it was still true. But the door itself had been held open by someone she hadn't known was standing there, and adjusting to that knowledge required something she couldn't rush. What she was really working through was the question of what she thought about Declan Whitmore as a person, not as a professional connection, as a person who had watched a stranger on an airport floor and made a series of decisions that were, by any reasonable standard, generous, and had made them quietly, without requiring her to know or be grateful or perform anything in return. That was a harder thing to be angry about. It was, if she was honest, not something she could stay angry about at all. She just needed to arrive at not angry, on her own schedule, in her own way, without anyone hurrying her there. She arrived there sometime in the 3rd week of April. It wasn't a dramatic arrival. It happened on a Tuesday evening when she was making dinner. Pasta, nothing special, the kind of Tuesday dinner you make when the day has been long and you want food that doesn't require decisions. And she was thinking about the bridge project pilot site visit she'd conducted the week before, in a rural county outside Spokane, where a local companion program was operating out of a church basement with 2 paid staff members and 17 volunteers and managing to cover 43 homebound seniors in a 50-mile radius. The program director was a woman named Cora, 68, who had been doing this work since her husband died 15 years ago, and who had the kind of earned expertise that no credential could replicate. Lena had spent 4 hours with her and come back with 12 pages of notes and the clear conviction that this was the first partner the pilot program should fund. She'd sent the recommendation to Declan's office 2 days later through Serena in the formal project channel. The response had come back from Declan directly rather than through Serena, which broke from the usual routing, and it said, "This is the right call. Site visit model is working. What do you need from us to move the Spokane partnership forward?" Just that. No preamble, no management language, no softening. Just a direct question from one person to another about how to make the work better. She stirred her pasta and thought about that. Then she picked up her phone and sent him a text from the number he'd given all the bridge project participants at the first session. "I'd like to talk, not about the project, just talk, if you have time this week." She put the phone down and finished making dinner. The response came while she was draining the pasta, and she read it with one hand holding the colander over the sink. "Thursday, coffee. You pick the place." She picked a coffee shop 3 blocks from the foundation office. Not a place she went often enough for it to feel like her territory, but familiar enough that she wasn't walking into entirely foreign ground. She arrived 4 minutes early and ordered a coffee and sat at a table near the window. He arrived exactly on time, which she was beginning to understand was a characteristic rather than a coincidence, and ordered something and sat down across from her and didn't open with small talk, which she also appreciated. "Thank you for reaching out," he said. "I needed some time." "I know. It was fair." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I've been thinking about what you said in the conference room, about the decision you made, not telling me until I was settled. And? I think you made it for the right reasons," she said. "I still think it was mine to know sooner, but I understand the reasoning, and I'm not—" She paused. "I'm not holding it." He looked at her steadily. "You didn't have to let it go." "I know," she said. "That's why I did." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "At the airport, when you stayed with him, what were you thinking?" She thought about it. Not about what the answer should be. She'd been asked versions of this question enough times in her head that she'd gotten past the performed answers, but about what was actually true. "I wasn't thinking much," she said. "I saw him go down, and I knew I could either walk toward the gate or walk toward him, and I walked toward him. That was most of the decision." She paused. "After that, I was thinking about his pulse, whether it was regular, whether the EMTs were going to get there fast enough, what I would do if they didn't." She looked at her cup. "I thought about my flight. I won't pretend I didn't. I thought about it, and then I thought, I can't leave, and that was it." "You knew it was leaving." "I didn't know for certain, but I suspected." She looked at him. "You want to know why I stayed anyway?" "No," he said. "I understand why. What I want to know is, did you regret it in the moments after, sitting alone in that terminal?" She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "For about 20 minutes I regretted it pretty hard. I sat there, and I thought about 11 months of night shifts, and I thought about what the interview had cost to get to, and I thought, what did I just do?" She paused. "And then I thought about his pulse under my fingers, and whether he'd made it, and the regret got smaller. And by the time I'd been sitting there an hour, it was mostly gone. Mostly. I'm not a saint," she said. "I'm not going to tell you it disappeared cleanly, and I felt at peace. It hurt. It just hurt less than the alternative would have." He nodded slowly. "The alternative being leaving. The alternative being the kind of person who keeps walking." He was quiet after that in a way that wasn't uncomfortable. The coffee shop was doing its usual mid-morning business around them, laptops and headphones and the mild percussion of someone shoe tapping under a table 2 seats over, and neither of them rushed to fill the silence. "My daughter wants to meet you," he said eventually. Lena looked at him. "What?" "She's been asking about you since November. She calls you the airport lady, which I've tried to correct, but she's committed to it." The corner of his mouth moved. "She has opinions about things, and she holds them." "How old is she?" "She turned 7 in February. She's a lot." He said it with the particular helpless warmth of a parent describing a child who regularly defeats them. "She heard me mention the bridge project once and asked if the airport lady was involved, and when I said yes, she said she wanted to come to a meeting." "Please don't bring a 7-year-old to a bridge project meeting." I told her that. She was unsatisfied with the answer. Lena found herself smiling, which surprised her slightly. "She sounds like she knows what she wants." "She always has," he said, "since she was about 14 months old. She pointed at things she wanted with this absolute certainty, like she'd already decided and was just informing the room." He paused. "Her mother was like that too." He said it simply, without apparent pain, but there was something in the way he said it that had weight. The kind of weight that means you've learned to carry something rather than that it no longer exists. She didn't ask about it. It wasn't the right conversation for that. "I don't know that I'm not sure what meeting her would look like," she said. "It doesn't have to be anything formal. She'd probably want to show you Professor and tell you about a dinosaur she saw in Chicago and then lose interest and go find something else to do. She's not—" He paused. "I'm not asking for anything complicated. I just think she'd feel better knowing you're real and fine." "She worries about me?" "She checked in on it, periodically." He said it with the tone of someone who found this both slightly ridiculous and entirely characteristic. She has a strong sense of unfinished business. Lena thought about a 6-year-old girl in an airport asking why the airport lady was the only one helping. She thought about that question and what it said about who had raised her. "Okay," she said. "Not a meeting, something low pressure." "There's a thing Maisie does every Saturday morning," he said. "Farmer's market near our place. She has a whole route. The pretzel stand first, then the flower stand where the woman knows her name, then the cheese sample table, which she takes very seriously. It's not—" He seemed to catch himself getting into it and stopped. "You don't have to." "No, She paused. "That sounds fine, actually. Normal." "It's very normal," he said. "It's aggressively normal." She smiled again. It felt less surprising this time. "Saturday, then. What time?" They settled the details and finished their coffees, and he had to leave first, at 10 o'clock at his own office building, and he said goodbye with the slight formality of someone who was still calibrating the distance between where they'd been and where they were now. She watched him go and sat for another few minutes with her coffee cooling and thought about the fact that 4 months ago she'd been sitting in an airport terminal with $43 in her account and a flight that had departed without her. She thought about what Diane had said. Can you just let something go right? She thought it might be, finally, going right. Saturday was gray and slightly drizzly, which was Seattle's version of normal spring weather, and which neither of them appeared to have dressed particularly for. He was in a jacket that worked for rain and wasn't about it. She had her old green coat, the one from the airport, which had turned out to be warm enough for Seattle winters, and which she'd decided she liked too much to replace with something more professional looking. They met at the market entrance at 9:15, and Maisie looked at Lena for approximately 4 full seconds, with the unfiltered assessment of a 7-year-old, and then said, "You're taller than I thought." "Is that okay?" Lena asked. Maisie considered it. "Yes," she concluded, and took her father's hand and started walking. The pretzel stand was first, as advertised. Maisie ordered with the confidence of a regular, and then offered Lena a piece of hers without being asked, which Lena accepted and which was a good pretzel. Warm, properly salted, the kind you could only get from a stand that had been doing it long enough to have the process right. They ate while walking toward the flower stand, and Maisie talked about the dinosaur at the Field Museum in Chicago and how its name was Sue, and how Sue was technically gender neutral because they didn't know for sure, and Maisie had decided that Sue was a girl anyway because she liked her. "That seems like a reasonable decision," Lena said. "Daddy said I can't just decide an extinct animal's gender." "You can debate that," Lena said. "That's what I said." Maisie gave her father a vindicated look. He looked at the sky. The flower stand woman, Elena, 60-ish, who clearly did know Maisie's name and used it with the warmth of genuine affection, sold Maisie a single stem of something yellow that Maisie identified as a sunflower despite it being obviously too small to be a sunflower, and which Elena agreed was definitely a sunflower, and which Lena was brought in to confirm. "I think it might be a ranunculus," Lena said, looking at it. "It's a sunflower," Maisie said firmly. "Then it's a sunflower," Lena said. They went to the cheese table. Maisie did take it seriously. She tasted 3 samples with genuine concentration, asked one question about the aging process of a sharp cheddar that surprised the vendor enough that he answered it at length, and ultimately pointed at a small block of something herbed and told her father she needed it. He bought it without argument. Walking between the stalls, Maisie held the yellow flower in one hand and the block of herbed cheese in the other and looked at Lena sideways. "Were you scared?" she said. "At the airport?" Lena looked at her. "A little, yes." "But you stayed anyway." "Yes." Maisie thought about this for several steps. "My teacher says being brave means doing it even when you're scared, not when you're not scared." "Your teacher is right." "I know," Maisie said with equanimity. "She's usually right. It's kind of annoying." She looked up at Lena. "Did the man get better?" "I think so," Lena said. "He looked pretty good the next time I saw him." She felt Declan look at her from the side, a quick, private look that she didn't turn to meet but registered. She kept her eyes on Maisie. Good, Maisie said, satisfied, and returned her attention to navigating the market crowd with her flour and her cheese. They stayed for an hour. The drizzle came and went. Maisie found a stall selling handmade clay beads and spent 15 minutes in serious deliberation over which ones to buy with the $4 she had in her coat pocket, eventually selecting 2 blue ones and one that was greenish-gray and that she said looked like the ocean. Lena helped her count the change. Declan held the umbrella he'd produced from somewhere over Maisie's deliberations without being asked. It was not a complicated morning. It was just a morning. Imperfect, wet at the edges, full of the ordinary small negotiations of moving through a busy space with a child who had strong opinions about cheese and flowers and extinct animals. Lena had not expected to feel comfortable in it. She did. When they said goodbye at the market entrance, Maisie hugged Lena around the middle without warning, briefly and completely, the way children hug when they've decided something and are acting on the decision before it can be reconsidered. Lena put her hand on the back of the small head, and the hug lasted about 3 seconds, and then Maisie pulled back and looked up at her. "You can come next Saturday too if you want," she said. "We always do the same route, so you'll know where to go." Lena looked at her. "Maybe I will," she said. Maisie nodded, satisfied, and turned and took her father's hand. He looked at Lena over his daughter's head with an expression she was getting better at reading, complicated and genuine and not asking for anything. "Thank you," he said, "for this." "Thank her," Lena said, and meant it about Maisie and also didn't entirely. She walked home through the drizzle with her hands in her pockets and thought about the morning and didn't try to categorize it yet. The pilot program launched in June. 3 counties, 7 partner organizations, the Spokane program with Cora as the anchor. The documentation framework Lena had built was in place. The travel-adjusted metrics Thomas had developed were running. The lead time protocol she'd proposed to the board in February had been approved and implemented, meaning the partners had 90 days of notice on funding decisions instead of 30, which Ruth Okafor had acknowledged with a brief email that said simply, "Noted improvement, thank you," which from Ruth was essentially a standing ovation. The bridge project worked. Not perfectly. Nothing worked perfectly. And Lena had stopped expecting it to around the same time she'd stopped being new. In the first 3 months of the pilot, one partner organization fell significantly behind on its reporting and had to be put on a corrective plan, which Lena handled directly and without punishing language, but also without pretending the problem wasn't there. One county had a staffing crisis that required the foundation to temporarily increase support hours, which strained the pilot budget and required a conversation with Declan's foundation about bridging the gap. The conversation happened quickly and without drama, which was one of the things Lena had come to appreciate about working with him. He moved fast when it mattered and didn't require a long runway to make decisions. Victor came to the Spokane site visit in August. He didn't announce it. He simply appeared on the day, driving himself, which Lena had learned he still did despite everything, and which Cora had responded to by producing coffee and sitting with him for 40 minutes in the church basement while Lena conducted the formal assessment with the program staff. When Lena came out of the staff meeting, Victor and Cora were laughing about something, and it was the most relaxed she'd seen Victor look in the 8 months she'd known him. "You know each other?" Lena asked. "We do now," Cora said. Victor looked at Lena with the expression she'd learned meant he was satisfied about something but wasn't going to make a production of it. "Good program," he said. "Good assessment." "It's a good program because Cora built something that worked," Lena said. "I'm just describing it accurately." Cora looked at Victor. "I like her," she said. "Most people do," Victor said. Eventually. Lena drove back to Seattle on the highway with the late August sun coming in at an angle through the driver's side window and thought about what eventually meant, coming from Victor. She'd been in Seattle for 8 months. The apartment was no longer empty. There were books on the shelves and a rug she'd found at a second-hand store, and Frank's birdhouse on the wall, and biscuits domained by the radiator. She had a route at the grocery store she didn't think about anymore, which was how you knew somewhere had become real rather than temporary. She called Diane from the road, hands-free, the way she always did on long drives, because long drives and Diane had always gone together. "How's Spokane?" Diane said. "Good. Really good. Victor came." "Victor just shows up to things?" "Apparently. He also befriended the program director in 40 minutes over coffee. That's a little adorable for a man that intimidating. Don't tell him that. How are things otherwise? Diane said, in the particular tone that meant she was asking about multiple things at once. Good, Lena said. Things are, yeah, good. You and Declan. Diane. I'm just asking. Lena watched the highway open up ahead of her, the eastern Washington landscape flattening out into something wide and dry and honest. It's not a thing yet. I don't know what it is. We see each other for the project and sometimes for coffee, and Maisie has conscripted me into the Saturday farmers market, which has apparently been going on for 6 weeks now, without me quite registering how that happened. 6 weeks of farmers markets isn't nothing. I know it isn't nothing. Does he know you know it isn't nothing? She thought about the last Saturday, which had ended with the three of them eating lunch at a place near the market that had a kids' menu Maisie had opinions about, and which had run 2 hours without anyone noticing until Maisie declared she needed to go home because Professor was alone. Walking out into the afternoon. The way he'd looked at her when Maisie ran ahead to the car. The look that didn't ask for anything but was there anyway. He knows, she said. And I'm not rushing, she said. Everything in this particular story happened too fast for me to track it at first. I'm going at my own speed now. That sounds healthy, Diane said. Also a little frustrating to watch from the outside. Then stop watching. You know I can't do that. She smiled at the road. I know. The program documentation report that Lena published in September was the Foundation's first standardized cross-partner assessment in its 4-year history. Thomas had spent 6 weeks building the data visualization layer. Priya had handled the external partner communications. Ruth Okafor had reviewed the methodology and sent back 7 pages of notes, most of which were correct, all of which Lena had incorporated, and it ended with a line that said, "This is the kind of work that makes the rest of the work possible." Lena had printed that one and put it on her desk, which was still facing the window. Victor read the full report and called her into his office and said, "You've changed how this organization operates." "The organization changed how it operates," she said. "I just asked the right questions." "That is changing how an organization operates," he said. "That's what it looks like from the inside." She sat across from him and thought about all the time she'd sat across from him, the airport terminal in her mind's eye, though she hadn't been conscious of watching, and then the interview room in November, and then this office, again and again, each conversation building on the last. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer it honestly." "I generally do," he said. "Did you know who I was before the interview? Before Declan called you?" He looked at her steadily. "No, I was unconscious. I didn't know your name until Declan told me." "But once you knew, did it affect your judgment?" "In the room. Be honest." He was quiet for a moment, long enough to be taking the question seriously. "It brought you into the room," he said finally. "Your character in that terminal is what made me want to meet you. But once you were in the room, no. What you said in that interview, the things you knew, the way you thought about the work, that's what gave me the answer. The airport was the door. What you did with the hour and 40 minutes inside it was yours entirely." She held his gaze. "I believe you," she said. "Good," he said, "because I don't say things I don't mean. You've had long enough to verify that." She had. She got up to leave and he stopped her at the door with, "One more thing." She turned. "The Foundation is going to expand the pilot to 2 additional regions next year. I want you to lead the national strategy, not as an additional duty, as the role's evolution. The title changes, the scope changes, the team grows." She looked at him. "How big does the team grow?" "That's partly your decision. I'll need Thomas full-time. Done. And Priya moves into a senior coordinator role, not a support one." "Agreed. I'll need a month to build the proposal." "Take 6 weeks," he said. "Get it right." She took 4 because she was still that kind of person and probably always would be. The Saturday routine had become a standing thing by October. Not every week. There were weeks when work pulled one of them elsewhere, or Maisie had a thing, or it rained in the particular way that even Seattle residents drew a line at. but enough weeks that it had a shape, a weight, a place in the regular architecture of how they moved through the world. Maisie had started calling her Lena instead of the airport lady sometime in September, which she reported to her father in a matter-of-fact way that suggested she'd made a decision and implemented it, and which Declan reported to Lena in a text with no commentary, and which Lena had read 3 times and then set her phone down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. In October, after a Saturday market that had ended early because it rained after all, the 3 of them were in Declan's kitchen. Maisie had declared she was making hot chocolate, which she did with the solemn focus of a professional, measuring the cocoa with extreme precision. And Lena was leaning against the counter watching her, and Declan was beside her, close enough that she could feel the presence of him without looking. "She's going to put too much cocoa," he said quietly. "Then it'll be strong hot chocolate," Lena said. "She doesn't drink it strong." "Then she'll learn." Maisie added an extra scoop of cocoa with the serenity of someone who had committed to a vision. He looked at Lena, not with the careful, contained expression he'd worn in the conference room in March, or the calibrated look from the farmer's market, but with something quieter and more settled. The look of someone who had been patient about something long enough to stop thinking of it as patience and start thinking of it as just how things were. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. Meaning O'Hare, meaning Seattle, meaning probably the kitchen. She looked at him, then at Maisie, who was pouring warm milk with fierce concentration. "So am I," she said. It was the truest thing she'd said in a long time, and she meant all of it. Later, when Maisie had presented them each with a mug of hot chocolate that was in fact extremely strong, and had declared it perfect and gotten no argument from either of them, they sat at the kitchen table while the rain came down outside. Maisie talked about Sue the dinosaur, whom she had been researching and about whom she had further opinions, and Lena asked questions that were genuine because the research was actually interesting, and Declan drank his very strong hot chocolate without complaint because his daughter had made it. Outside, the rain did what Seattle rain does in October. Settled in, patient, committed to the long view. Victor Ashford read the national strategy proposal in November, 13 months after a man collapsed on an airport floor, and one woman made a decision that cost her everything she'd been working toward. He read it in his Seattle office on a Tuesday morning with his coffee going cold because he forgot it was there. When he finished, he sat for a while without doing anything, which was still where his thinking happened. Then he picked up his pen and wrote one word across the top of the cover page. Yes. He put the proposal in his outbox and looked out his window at the November sky, the same tentative light, the same committed gray, and thought about a terminal full of people walking past a man on the floor. He thought about how easy it was to walk past things, how the speed of ordinary life created a kind of permission for it. There was always somewhere else to be, always a flight leaving, always a reason the next person would handle it. And then he thought about one person who didn't have a reason good enough to keep walking. He thought about what that person had built in a year, not from gratitude or obligation or the clean arc of a lesson learned, just from showing up and doing the work and asking the right questions and refusing to let the distance between what existed and what should exist feel like someone else's problem. He didn't think it made a simple story. Life rarely produced simple stories, and the ones that seemed simple were usually the ones where you hadn't looked closely enough. This one had sharp edges. The cost of the missed flight, the months of night shifts, the conference room confrontation, the difficult work of trusting a version of events you hadn't known the full shape of. It had complications that didn't resolve cleanly into lessons, but it had ended up here. A proposal on his desk with yes written across it. A program that would reach 4 new regions and hundreds of people who had been outside the frame of what was possible before. A woman who had walked into his foundation's orbit through an airport terminal and had turned out to be exactly what she'd seemed in that first hour and 40 minutes, which in Victor's experience was rarer than anything. He thought about Declan calling him that morning in November. "I need to ask you something," and how the question had turned out to be about a woman in a green coat who had knelt on a cold floor and refused to leave. He thought about what it said, that the one person who stopped had been the one who could least afford to. He didn't try to make it into a clean principle. Life wasn't clean principles. It was specific people making specific choices at specific moments, and most of those moments were smaller than this one. and most of them went unwitnessed. And most of the time there was no Victor Ashford on the floor, and no Declan Whitmore slowing down in the aisle, and no rescheduled interview. Most of the time you made the right choice, and it cost you something, and nothing came back from it, and you lived with that, and you went to work the next day, and you kept being the person who stayed. That was the harder version of the story, the one most people were actually living. But sometimes, not often, not reliably, not as any kind of guarantee, the accounting caught up. Not because the universe was fair, it wasn't, but because people like Declan Whitmore existed and occasionally slowed down in an airport aisle, and because the work of caring about people accumulated into something real even when it didn't seem like it was going anywhere. Victor finished his coffee, cold as it was, and stood up and went to his next meeting. Lena didn't know about the word written on the cover page yet. She found out on Thursday when Carol forwarded the approved proposal with a brief congratulatory note and Victor's signature at the bottom, and she was in the middle of a meeting with Thomas about the Q3 data when the email came in, and she read it on her phone under the table and then put her phone face down and looked at the data Thomas was explaining and thought, this is it. This is what it looks like. Not the arrival at somewhere finished. There was no finished. There was the expanded team and the 4 new regions, and Cora in Spokane, and Ruth Okafor's ongoing emails with their 7 pages of notes, and the documentation framework that needed continuous attention, and the caregiver retention problem that was going to take years to move meaningfully, and the 100 things that were better, and the 100 things that weren't yet. But this was what it looked like when the work took hold, when the container fit. When you built something that had your actual fingerprints on it because you'd come from the ground up and you knew what the ground felt like. After the meeting ended, she went to her office, the one with the desk facing the window, and sat down and looked at the November sky. She thought about Millhaven, the library computer and the application and the voice memos in the break room and 11 months of night shifts. She thought about the airport, the cold floor, the pulse under her fingers, the departures board. She thought about the hotel room with the runway view and the drive to Seattle with her whole life in a van, and Frank's birdhouse on the wall, and Biscuit asleep by the radiator, and Priya's laugh through 2 closed doors, and Ruth Okafor's 7 pages of notes that were usually right. She thought about a farmer's market in the rain, strong hot chocolate, a 7-year-old with absolute opinions about extinct animals. She thought about what staying cost and what it opened. She didn't have a clean conclusion for any of it. It wasn't the kind of story that resolved into a lesson you could fold up small and carry around. It was messier than that, and more specific, and more hers. She'd made one decision on an airport floor, not a heroic one, not a calculated one, just the only decision she could make and still be herself. And it had unwound into something she hadn't imagined and couldn't have planned for. And the unwinding wasn't finished yet. That was okay. She'd learned to be all right with stories that weren't finished. She turned back to her desk. The national strategy proposal was open on her screen. The rural coverage map that Thomas had built was pulled up on the secondary monitor. There was a coffee going cold at her elbow that she'd forgotten was there. She picked it up. Still warm enough, she started to work.